A cruel billionaire fired his pregnant maid, accusing her of trying to trap him for money. The wrongful termination lawsuit revealed through DNA testing that she was actually his daughter from a college relationship, making her unborn child his first grandchild. His discrimination had caused him to reject 2 generations of his own family. Before we get into the story, comment below where in the world you are watching from today. The sterile white of the doctor's office felt colder than the November rain lashing against the window panes. Isabella clutched her swollen belly, the weight of her unborn child a stark contrast to the emptiness gnawing at her heart. Julian Thorne's cruel words echoed in her ears, a venomous sting sharper than any physical pain. Trapping him for money, he'd sneered, his icy gaze stripping her of her dignity. The scent of antiseptic did little to mask the bitter taste of injustice. Tears welled, blurring the already indistinct lines of the medical chart. Financial ruin loomed, a bleak future painted in shades of gray. Hope, once a vibrant flame, flickered weakly. She'd worked tirelessly for Julian, her hands roughened from scrubbing his opulent mansion, her spirit bruised by his casual cruelty. He hadn't just fired her. He'd shattered her sense of worth. A gentle hand touched her arm. Sarah, her lawyer, her unexpected champion, offered a small, encouraging smile. The DNA test results are in, Isabella, Sarah said softly, her voice a balm to Isabella's raw emotions. The words hung heavy in the air, pregnant with unspoken implications. The silence stretched, taut and expectant, a prelude to a revelation that would irrevocably alter their lives. Isabella's heart pounded a frantic rhythm against her ribs, a drumbeat of fear and anticipation. The weight of the truth, poised on the edge of disclosure, felt heavier than her pregnancy. Sarah slid the results across the desk, the crisp paper a stark contrast to the tremor in Isabella's hand. The sterile scent of the office seemed to amplify the suffocating silence. Isabella's eyes, usually bright with a quiet resilience, were clouded with a mixture of fear and apprehension. She unfolded the paper, her breath catching in her throat. The stark black lettering was a sentence, a life-altering verdict. Positive, she whispered, the word hanging in the air, fragile as a newborn sigh. Sarah's hand rested gently on Isabella's. It confirms what we suspected, she said, her voice soft but firm. You are Julian Thorne's daughter. The weight of the revelation crashed down, not with a thunderous boom, but a slow, agonizing crumble. Tears streamed down Isabella's face, hot and cleansing. Anger, hurt, disbelief. A maelstrom of emotions surged within her. She had been discarded like refuse, her dignity trampled by a man who was, unbeknownst to her, her father. The injustice of it all was a physical blow. Outside, the November rain intensified, a melancholic symphony mirroring her inner turmoil. The cold seeped into the room, a chilling reminder of the icy indifference Julian had shown her. Isabella's trembling hand clutched her belly, seeking solace in the life growing within, a life that had become entangled in a web of deceit and bitter betrayal. The unborn child, a symbol of hope, now felt like a hostage in this cruel family drama. What do I do now? She whispered, her voice barely audible above the drumming rain. Sarah's answer was a quiet promise, a beacon in the storm. We fight for justice, Isabella, for you and for your child. The fight had just begun, and the stakes were higher than ever before. The news spread like wildfire. Headlines screamed of the billionaire's scandalous secret, his DNA-confirmed daughter, unjustly fired while pregnant. Julian, ensconced in his opulent penthouse, felt the first tremors of his carefully constructed world cracking. The city's relentless hum, usually a comforting backdrop to his power, now felt like a mocking chorus. He poured another whiskey, the amber liquid burning a path down his throat, failing to quench the fire of his anxiety. The phone buzzed incessantly, lawyers, shareholders, demanding answers he didn't have. His reflection in the polished mahogany bar stared back, a stranger masked by expensive suits and carefully cultivated indifference. But beneath the surface, fear gnawed. He'd built an empire on ruthless efficiency, but this This was a battle he couldn't buy his way out of. Meanwhile, Isabella, surrounded by the comforting chaos of her family's small apartment, felt a different kind of pressure building. The warmth of her mother's hand on her back couldn't completely dispel the icy chill that remained. Her sister, Maria, chattered about the news, her usual upbeat demeanor laced with worry. The scent of her mother's cooking, usually a source of comfort, now mingled with the metallic tang of fear. "They're all saying he'll try to buy you off," Maria said, her voice hushed. Isabella nodded, her gaze fixed on the flickering television screen. The image of Julian's impassive face, a stark contrast to the turmoil within her. "He won't," she said, her voice stronger than she felt. "This isn't about the money. It's about justice." The weight of her pregnancy, once a source of pure joy, now felt heavy, burdened by the weight of this unexpected truth. Her hand instinctively went to her belly, a silent reassurance to the life within. The fight for justice was now a fight for her child's future. The rain outside hammered against the window panes, mirroring the storm brewing inside her. But somewhere amidst the fear, a quiet flame of determination began to burn. The lawyer, Sarah, arrived at Isabella's cramped apartment, the scent of frying onions and simmering anxiety thick in the air. Isabella, her face pale but resolute, sat clutching a worn teddy bear, a stark contrast to the sharp lines of her burgeoning belly. The television blared a news report, Julian Thorne's face, cold and unyielding, filling the screen. They're saying he'll offer a settlement," Isabella whispered, her voice catching. The fear in her eyes was a palpable thing, a chilling counterpoint to the warmth radiating from her family gathered around. Sarah, a woman whose kindness was as evident as the sharp intelligence in her eyes, squeezed Isabella's hand. "We'll handle it, Isabella. This isn't just about the money. It's about what he did to you." Maria, Isabella's younger sister, burst in, a whirlwind of nervous energy. "They're calling him a monster, a heartless billionaire. Even Abuela's watching." The old woman, her face etched with worry, nodded silently from a nearby armchair, her rosary beads clicking a steady rhythm. The apartment, small and overflowing with the comforting clutter of family life, felt suddenly small, suffocating under the weight of the unfolding scandal. The chipped paint on the walls, the worn rug underfoot, all seemed to bear witness to Isabella's quiet strength. Outside, the city roared, a relentless symphony of indifference to her plight. Yet, within those four walls, a different kind of strength was growing, a fierce determination fueled by love and the promise of a new life. The weight of the accusations, the public scrutiny, the sheer audacity of Julian Thorne's actions, it all threatened to crush Isabella. But in the steady gaze of her mother, in the supportive whispers of her sister, in the silent prayer of her abuela, she found a resilience she hadn't known she possessed. The fear was still there, a sharp, persistent ache, but it was overshadowed by a growing sense of purpose, a quiet resolve to fight for herself and her child. This was no longer just about a job. It was about justice, about dignity, about the future. And Isabella, despite her fear, was ready to fight. The legal aid office smelled faintly of old paper and desperation. Isabella sat across from Sarah, a lawyer whose kind eyes belied the steely determination in her jaw. The fluorescent lights hummed a monotonous tune, a stark contrast to the chaotic symphony of emotions swirling inside Isabella. "The initial filings, they've been rejected," Sarah said, her voice soft but firm. The words landed like stones in Isabella's stomach, a cold dread spreading through her. She clutched her belly, a protective instinct overriding the despair threatening to engulf her. "But why?" Isabella whispered, her voice barely audible above the hum. Tears welled, blurring the already harsh lines of the room. Sarah reached across the desk, her hand covering Isabella's. "They're dismissing it as a simple case of wrongful termination. They don't see the bigger picture yet." A flashback flickered, a sun-drenched college campus, Julian's laughter echoing, a shared stolen kiss under the sprawling oak tree. The memory was bittersweet, a sharp pang of nostalgia against the bitter reality of the present. Julian's ambition had consumed him then, just as it did now, leaving a trail of broken hearts and shattered dreams in its wake. The present slammed back with the force of a tidal wave. Sarah's voice cut through the haze of memory. "We need more evidence, Isabella. Something concrete to prove his discriminatory actions." The weight of that responsibility settled heavily on Isabella's shoulders, a crushing burden she wasn't sure she could bear. The fear was palpable, a suffocating blanket smothering her hope. But beneath the fear, a flicker of resolve ignited, a tiny spark refusing to be extinguished. She would fight, for herself, for her child, for the justice she deserved. The fight had just begun. The scent of old paper suddenly seemed less oppressive, replaced by the faint but growing scent of defiance. The sterile white walls of the lab seemed to amplify the silence, a silence thick with unspoken dread. Isabella clutched a worn tissue, her knuckles bone white. The doctor's words hung in the air, heavy and irrevocable. The DNA confirms a 99.99% probability of paternity. The air tasted metallic, the scent of antiseptic sharp in her nostrils. She stared at the report, the stark black lettering blurring through her tears. Anger, raw and unyielding, clawed at her. It was a betrayal, a lifetime of denial condensed into a single, damning piece of paper. Sarah, her lawyer, reached across the small table, her hand warm and reassuring on Isabella's. I don't understand," Isabella whispered, her voice choked with emotion. The years of unspoken resentment towards a father she never knew, the pain of his callous dismissal, now intensified tenfold by this impossible truth. Sarah squeezed her hand gently. "It confirms the wrongful termination, and it changes everything." The weight of those words settled on Isabella's shoulders, crushing yet strangely liberating. The injustice was undeniable, the truth finally revealed. But the revelation brought no solace, only a confusing torrent of emotions. Grief for the father she never had, fury at the man he'd become, fear for the future of her child. A flashback, a faded photograph of a younger Julian, his eyes full of a youthful passion Isabella had only read about in old letters, a passion extinguished by the cold fire of ambition. It was a pain she now shared, a painful inheritance. This changes our strategy," Sarah said, her voice firm, guiding Isabella through the swirling maelstrom of her emotions. "We'll be filing an amended lawsuit, adding a claim for paternity." The image of Julian's face, usually mask-like and impassive, flickered in Isabella's mind, now distorted by the realization that the man who had wronged her was also her father. The fight had changed. It wasn't just about justice anymore. It was about family, about a truth that could either shatter them or mend them. The smell of antiseptic faded, replaced by the sharp, metallic tang of a future still uncertain, yet full of the potent promise of confrontation. The news spread like wildfire through the sterile hallways of the law firm. Sarah, her face etched with a mixture of concern and determination, guided Isabella through the initial shock. The plush, expensive furniture of Sarah's office felt strangely alien against the backdrop of Isabella's impoverished reality. The scent of expensive coffee hung heavy in the air, a stark contrast to the aroma of bleach and disinfectant that clung to Isabella's clothes from her last cleaning shift. "This changes everything, Isabella," Sarah repeated, her voice soft but firm. "We need to strategize. This isn't just about wrongful termination anymore. It's about paternity, about family." Isabella stared blankly out the window, the city a blurred tapestry of gray and black. The bustling streets, full of life and movement, felt a million miles away from the turmoil raging inside her. The weight of the revelation pressed down on her, heavy and suffocating. The hope she'd clung to, a fragile bud pushing through the hard soil of her circumstances, was now threatened by a bitter frost. I don't know what to feel," she whispered, her voice barely audible above the city's hum. Tears welled in her eyes, blurring her vision further. The crisp white of the DNA report seemed to mock her, a stark symbol of the truth she couldn't fully grasp. Sarah moved to her side, her touch gentle, offering comfort without words. The silence that followed was heavy with unspoken emotions. Isabella's confusion and grief, Sarah's unwavering resolve to fight for her client, and the undeniable weight of the truth. The next few days were a blur. The legal machinery started to grind into motion, an unstoppable force fueled by the shocking revelation. But amidst the flurry of paperwork and legal maneuvering, Isabella found herself sinking into a deep well of emotional exhaustion. The anger, the hurt, the disbelief, they warred within her, a chaotic storm threatening to consume her entirely. She found solace only in her small, cramped apartment, surrounded by the comforting presence of her loving, if impoverished, family. Their unwavering support was a lifeline, a small beacon of light in the overwhelming darkness. Yet, even surrounded by love, she couldn't shake the feeling of profound isolation, the jarring truth of her father's existence, adding a whole new layer of complexity to her already difficult life. The future, once a hopeful horizon, now appeared shrouded in uncertainty and fear. The scent of her mother's lavender potpourri, a familiar comfort, felt inadequate in the face of this unexpected reality. The lawyer's office, a sanctuary of expensive calm, felt like a prison. Isabella traced the rim of her chipped mug, the lukewarm tea doing little to soothe the icy dread that gripped her. Sarah, ever the professional, paced, her sharp heels clicking against the polished wood floor, a counterpoint to Isabella's internal chaos. "The media will be relentless," Sarah said, her voice low, laced with concern. "Julian Thorne, he's a public figure. This will explode." The news had shattered Isabella's world. The DNA results, stark and undeniable, had confirmed what she'd instinctively known for months, yet somehow never truly believed that the man who'd callously discarded her was also her father. The weight of this revelation pressed down, crushing her spirit under the burden of betrayal and disbelief. A sudden memory surfaced. The scent of old books and pipe tobacco in her mother's small apartment, the hushed, hurried whispers, the shadowed look in her mother's eyes when she spoke of Julian Thorne. The puzzle pieces, scattered for years, suddenly clicked into place, forming a heartbreaking mosaic of a love lost to ambition, a life shaped by a man's callous disregard. Tears stung her eyes, blurring the already indistinct cityscape outside. She felt the familiar sting of injustice, but now, layered over it was something deeper, a profound and aching sense of loss. The loss of a father she never had, the potential for a relationship stolen before it could even begin, and the fear of what this revelation would mean for her unborn child. "What about my baby?" she choked out, the words barely audible. The question hung in the air, heavy with unspoken anxieties. Sarah paused, her own eyes softening with empathy. "We'll protect your child, Isabella. We'll make sure this doesn't define her life." The promise felt thin, fragile as Isabella's hope. The ensuing silence was filled only with the low hum of the city outside, a distant lullaby to Isabella's sorrow. The fight was just beginning, a battle not just for justice, but for the fragile future she desperately wanted to safeguard. The news hung in the air, thick and suffocating. Isabella stared at the stark black lettering on the crisp white paper. The DNA results a brutal verdict. The sterile scent of the lawyer's office did little to mask the bitter tang of betrayal that coated her tongue. Sarah, her lawyer, watched with a mixture of professional concern and genuine sympathy, her usually sharp gaze softened by the weight of the revelation. Outside, the city roared, a relentless symphony of indifference to Isabella's shattered world. It's him," Isabella whispered, her voice barely a breath, the words catching in her throat. The confirmation, so coldly clinical, ripped through her carefully constructed composure. Anger, raw and blistering, warred with a deeper, more profound hurt, a hollowness that echoed the emptiness of her childhood. Sarah reached out, her hand covering Isabella's, a gesture of silent support. "I know this is devastating, Isabella, but we're going to fight for you, for your baby." But the fight felt insurmountable. The weight of Julian Thorne's wealth, his power, loomed like a dark cloud, threatening to extinguish any flickering ember of hope. Isabella squeezed her eyes shut, the sharp scent of the lawyer's expensive perfume suddenly cloying, offensive. She imagined Julian, his cold, calculating eyes, the cruel set of his jaw as he'd fired her. His words a venomous sting. The injustice was a physical thing, pressing down on her chest, stealing her breath. He knew? Isabella choked out, the words laced with accusation, self-pity and a dawning realization. He knew all along, the memory of her mother's whispered secrets, the shadowed glances, the carefully veiled sorrow, flooded back, painting a picture of a love lost to ambition, a sacrifice made at the altar of success. This wasn't just a wrongful termination. It was a rejection of 2 generations, a deliberate severing of a family line fueled by fear and self-preservation. Sarah remained silent, allowing Isabella to process the tidal wave of emotions. The silence, however, wasn't empty. It was thick with unspoken questions, with the weight of the future hanging precariously in the balance. The fight for justice had taken on a new dimension, a profound personal struggle that transcended legal battles and extended into the very core of Isabella's being. This wasn't just about money or a job. It was about reclaiming her identity, her family, her future. The fight had just begun. Julian sat alone in his penthouse, the city lights a blurry kaleidoscope below. The DNA results, stark and undeniable, were spread across his mahogany desk, a cruel mockery of his carefully constructed life. He swirled the amber liquid in his glass, the scotch burning a path down his throat, but offering no solace. The sterile clinical language of the report couldn't mask the raw, brutal truth. Isabella was his daughter whom he'd fired, accused of scheming. His grandchild, a life he'd carelessly cast aside. Guilt, sharp and agonizing, clawed at him. He'd built his empire on ambition, on ruthlessness, burying any vulnerability beneath layers of success. But now the success felt hollow, ash in his mouth. He could almost hear her voice, a quiet, dignified strength he'd never appreciated, now echoing in the cavernous silence of his apartment. The memory of Isabella's face, etched with shock and despair, was a searing brand. He saw the fear in her eyes, the fragile hope clinging to the edge of her resolve. He dismissed it as manipulation, as a desperate attempt to cling to his wealth. Now, the realization that it was genuine, that he'd wounded the very essence of his own blood, choked him. He ran a hand through his thinning hair, the movement jerky, uncontrolled. This wasn't a business deal gone wrong. This was a catastrophic failure of his humanity. His phone buzzed, a jarring interruption. It was his lawyer, his voice tight with concern. Mr. Thorne, the media. The rest was lost in a wave of nausea, the weight of the impending public storm crushing him. He switched off the phone, the silence that followed more oppressive than the impending chaos. His meticulously crafted image, his reputation, his entire world was about to come crashing down, leaving him exposed, vulnerable, and utterly alone. He took another long drink, the liquor offering only a temporary numbness, leaving the searing pain behind, sharper, more raw, more devastating than before. The sterile white of the lawyer's office felt like a stark contrast to the turmoil raging inside Julian. Sarah, his lawyer, placed the DNA results on the desk, the crisp paper a symbol of the life-altering truth. He stared at the report, the words blurring through a film of disbelief. It's conclusive, Mr. Thorne, Sarah said softly, her voice a gentle counterpoint to the earthquake shaking him. Isabella's reaction echoed in his memory. The stunned silence, followed by a quiet, controlled fury. He'd seen the hurt in her eyes, a hurt he'd inflicted. He'd dismissed it as a ploy, but now the truth felt like a physical blow. His carefully constructed world, built on ambition and a ruthless disregard for anything that threatened his success, was crumbling. I need time, Julian managed, his voice rough, betraying the tremor in his hands. The mahogany desk, usually a symbol of his power, felt cold and unyielding beneath his touch. The scent of old leather and expensive polish suddenly felt suffocating. Sarah nodded, her understanding gaze filled with a quiet empathy. Of course, Mr. Thorne. But this changes everything. The lawsuit, Isabella's claim. She paused, choosing her words carefully. This isn't just a legal matter anymore. This is about family. The weight of that word, family, crashed down on him. Family he'd thrown away twice. Once with Isabella's mother, a reckless abandonment fueled by ambition. And again with Isabella herself, blinded by his own arrogance. The city lights, visible through the office window, felt distant and cold. The usual exhilarating thrill of his success was replaced by an agonizing emptiness. The silence hung heavy, punctuated only by the rhythmic ticking of a clock, each tick a hammer blow to his already shattered composure. He needed to process this, to comprehend the devastating consequences of his actions. But where did he even begin? The enormity of the situation threatened to overwhelm him. The news hung in the air, thick and suffocating. Isabella sat across from Sarah, her hands clasped tightly in her lap, the pale skin stretched taut over her knuckles. The sterile scent of antiseptic from the clinic still clung to her clothes, a stark reminder of the test. Silence stretched, broken only by the rhythmic tick-tock of a clock on the wall. Each beat a hammer blow to Isabella's fragile hope. Tears welled, unshed, in her eyes. The lawyer's quiet presence was a lifeline in the maelstrom of emotions. "It's him, Sarah," Isabella whispered, her voice barely audible above the relentless ticking. "It's really him." The words held a mixture of disbelief, anger, and a deep, bone-chilling hurt. Sarah reached across the desk, her hand covering Isabella's. "I know, dear. This is overwhelming." The warmth of Sarah's touch was a small comfort in the face of the colossal revelation. The weight of it pressed down on Isabella, the crushing reality of a father she never knew, a man who had treated her with such callous disregard. Julian, meanwhile, paced his penthouse apartment, a gilded cage that now felt like a prison. The city lights twinkled mockingly below, a dazzling display that held no joy for him. The champagne he'd poured earlier sat untouched, its bubbles a stark contrast to the stillness in his soul. He ran a hand through his hair, the luxurious strands falling across his forehead, a futile attempt to quell the turmoil within. The DNA report lay discarded on his desk, a damning testament to his own cruelty. The guilt gnawed at him, a relentless beast tearing at his composure. He hadn't just fired a pregnant maid. He'd rejected his own daughter, his own grandchild. The sheer magnitude of his actions slammed into him with the force of a tidal wave, leaving him gasping for air. His reflection in the glass window showed a man ravaged by his own making, the carefully constructed facade of invulnerability crumbling beneath the weight of truth. The phone sat silently beside him, a symbol of his isolation, a bridge he couldn't bring himself to cross. He was alone, utterly and irrevocably alone, in the wreckage of his own creation. The news exploded. Julian Thorne, the name synonymous with ruthless ambition, found himself plastered across every tabloid, his carefully constructed image shattered. Headlines screamed of wrongful termination, a pregnant maid, and a shocking DNA revelation. The sterile white of his penthouse office felt colder than ever, the city lights a mocking reminder of his isolation. He swirled the remaining scotch, the amber liquid mirroring the turmoil in his gut. He'd built an empire on calculated risk, but this was a gamble he hadn't foreseen. Isabella, meanwhile, found solace in the warmth of her family's cramped apartment. The air, thick with the scent of frying onions and old memories, was a balm to her raw nerves. Her mother, her face etched with worry, held her close. "He'll pay," she murmured, her voice fierce, yet laced with pain. Isabella, however, felt no triumph. The revelation had ripped open a wound far deeper than the initial injustice. The anger was there, a simmering resentment against a man she'd never known, but it was overshadowed by a profound sadness, a hollow ache in the place where a father should have been. Sarah, her lawyer, called, her voice a calm counterpoint to the storm raging inside Isabella. "The media frenzy is escalating," she said. "They're demanding answers. Julian's reputation is plummeting. He's offered a settlement, but Sarah paused, choosing her words carefully. But he hasn't accepted it. Isabella sighed, the weight of it all settling heavily on her shoulders. A settlement wouldn't bring back the months of worry, the humiliation, the sheer injustice of it all. It wouldn't fill the void in her heart. Justice, she realized, was far more complicated than a simple financial payout. It was about recognition, acknowledgement, about the father she deserved, not the one who'd shown her such contempt. The coming weeks were a blur of depositions and press conferences, each appearance a fresh wound to her already fragile state. The relentless glare of the spotlight felt suffocating, a cruel reminder of the man who'd thrown her life into chaos. Yet, within this maelstrom, a quiet strength began to emerge, born from the unwavering support of her family and the unwavering belief of her lawyer. The battle was far from over, but Isabella was fighting not just for herself, but for the child growing within her, for the future they both deserved. The fight for justice was now a fight for her own self-worth, a fight against the man who had inadvertently stolen 2 generations of her family. The sterile white of the courtroom felt like a tomb. Isabella sat, her hand resting on her swollen belly, the cool fabric of her dress a stark contrast to the burning injustice in her heart. Julian, across the room, was a statue of controlled fury, his expensive suit unable to mask the tremor in his jaw. The lawyer's voice, a low hum, dissected the DNA results, each word a hammer blow against Julian's carefully constructed facade. "The results are irrefutable, Mr. Thorne," Sarah stated, her voice steady, unwavering. "Isabella Rodriguez is your daughter." The silence that followed was thick, suffocating. Julian's eyes, usually sharp and calculating, were clouded with a storm of emotions Isabella couldn't decipher. Shame, regret, or simply the cold calculation of damage control. She couldn't tell. Later, in the hushed quiet of her family's apartment, Isabella clutched a worn photograph of her mother, her eyes brimming with unshed tears. The scent of her mother's lavender perfume, faint but persistent, was a bittersweet reminder of a life cut short, a love betrayed. "He'll pay," her mother's voice echoed in her memory, a fierce whisper of defiance. Isabella looked at her reflection in the old cracked mirror, seeing not triumph, but a deep wound, a hole left by the missing presence of a father. The anger simmered beneath the surface, a potent brew mixed with an overwhelming sadness. The following days were a whirlwind. The media frenzy escalated. Every news channel dissected her story. Every tabloid splashed her face across its pages. The public's outrage was a double-edged sword. It validated her suffering but also amplified her sense of exposure, her vulnerability. She found solace only in the unwavering support of her family, their love a warm blanket against the storm. But deep within, a silent question echoed. Would Julian ever understand the devastation he'd wrought? Would he ever truly see her, not just as a pregnant maid, but as his daughter? The weight of that question was heavier than any legal battle. The news spread like wildfire. Julian Thorne, the titan of industry, the man who built his empire on ruthlessness, was facing a scandal of epic proportions. His meticulously crafted image, polished to a gleaming perfection, was cracking under the weight of the truth. Headlines screamed, "Billionaire's secret daughter." The whispers followed him into boardrooms and charity galas, a chilling chorus of disbelief and condemnation. He felt the gaze of the city, millions of eyes scrutinizing his every move. The air, usually thick with the scent of expensive cologne and power, now tasted of ash and betrayal. Isabella, meanwhile, found refuge in the familiar chaos of her family's cramped apartment. The aroma of her abuela's cooking, a comforting blend of spices and simmering stew, was a balm to her frayed nerves. The gentle murmur of her sisters' voices, their shared concern a silent embrace, eased the sharp edges of her pain. Yet, the exhaustion was bone-deep, a weariness that went beyond the demands of her pregnancy. The weight of the public eye, the relentless media attention, pressed down on her like a physical burden. One evening, amidst the flurry of phone calls from Sarah and the persistent buzzing of her phone, a quiet knock came at the door. It was her cousin, Maria, holding a steaming mug. "Abuela says you need this," she whispered, handing Isabella a mug of chamomile tea. The warmth of the ceramic cup in her hands was a small comfort against the chill of fear that gripped her. "Thank you, Mija," Isabella sighed, her voice raspy with exhaustion. I don't know what to expect." Maria squeezed her hand. "He'll regret this," she said fiercely, her voice brimming with protective anger. "He'll pay for what he's done." Isabella looked at her cousin, at the unwavering support in her eyes, and a small spark of hope ignited within her. The road ahead was long and uncertain, but she was not alone. The strength of her family, the fire of her own resolve, these were her weapons in the battle ahead. The fight for justice had begun. The fight for acknowledgement, for family, for a future where her child wouldn't be a casualty of her father's cruelty, was just beginning. The courtroom buzzed, a hive of hushed whispers and rustling papers. Julian, perched on the edge of his expensive leather chair, felt the sweat prickling his skin despite the air conditioning. He watched Isabella, her face pale but resolute, as she testified. The fluorescent lights cast harsh shadows on her swollen eyes, highlighting the exhaustion etched into her features. Her voice, though soft, carried a strength that surprised even him. Each word was a carefully chosen weapon, piercing the carefully constructed walls of his denial. "He said I was trying to trap him," she said, her voice barely above a whisper, yet every word resonated in the suffocating silence. "He didn't even look at me, didn't care about the child growing inside me. He just dismissed me." A single tear traced a path down her cheek, catching the light like a tiny, glittering shard of glass. The lawyer, Sarah, a woman whose compassion radiated from her every pore, placed a comforting hand on Isabella's arm. Julian flinched. He hadn't seen such genuine kindness in years, a feeling foreign and unsettling in its intensity. He saw the faces of the jury, their expressions unreadable, yet he felt the weight of their judgment pressing down on him. The weight of his own actions, the devastating consequences of his cruelty, loomed over him like a physical presence. The carefully cultivated image of the ruthless billionaire crumbled further, replaced by a terrifying sense of vulnerability, a raw and unsettling exposure of his own failings. He closed his eyes briefly, trying to shut out the onslaught of emotions. Regret, shame, and a gnawing fear of the inevitable. The judge's gavel fell, sharp and decisive, shattering the tense silence. The trial was adjourned, but for Julian, the reckoning had only just begun. The courtroom, a place of sterile formality, seemed to suffocate him with the weight of his actions. As he pushed through the throng of reporters, their cameras flashing like relentless fireflies, a wave of nausea washed over him. The public's condemnation, the relentless media scrutiny, paled in comparison to the torment he inflicted upon himself. He was trapped, not by Isabella's lawsuit, but by his own conscience. His carefully built empire felt like a house of cards, teetering on the brink of collapse. The mahogany of Julian's desk felt cold against his palms. He stared at the offer letter, the crisp paper a stark contrast to the turmoil raging inside him. A substantial settlement, enough to silence Isabella, to bury the truth beneath a mountain of cash. But the ink blurred, the zeros swimming before his eyes. He wasn't buying silence, he was buying guilt. He picked up the phone, his hand trembling slightly. Isabella's voice, though soft, carried the unwavering strength of her convictions. He watched her, her face pale but resolute, her hand resting gently on her swollen belly. The fluorescent lights seemed to amplify the silence, each tick of the clock a hammer blow against the fragile structure of his denial. "Mr. Thorne," the judge's voice, calm but firm, broke through the tense silence. "The evidence presented is compelling." The words hung in the air, a prelude to a verdict that felt like a death sentence to Julian's carefully constructed life. He saw Sarah, Isabella's lawyer, her expression unreadable, yet a flicker of satisfaction danced in her eyes. He had underestimated her, underestimated the strength of a woman driven by justice, by a belief in the truth that he had so desperately tried to bury. That night, alone in his opulent, yet now chillingly empty apartment. Julian poured himself a drink, the amber liquid offering no solace. The city lights blurred through the rain-streaked windows, mirroring the storm raging within him. The echoes of Isabella's testimony, the quiet dignity, the unspoken pain haunted him. He saw her face not as a maid, not as a legal opponent, but as his daughter carrying his grandchild. The realization hit him anew, a searing wave of guilt, remorse, and the raw, terrifying truth of his profound loss. He had rejected not just a daughter, but the chance to be a father, a grandfather. The weight of his choices, the crushing burden of his actions, threatened to suffocate him. He sank into the plush armchair, the silken fabric offering no comfort, the silence deafening. He reached for the phone, the impulse to call Isabella warring with the fear of rejection, the paralyzing dread of facing the consequences of his cruel indifference. The city lights outside remained a constant reminder of the life he had almost destroyed, of the family he had nearly lost. His empire of success felt like a cruel joke, a hollow mockery in the face of this overwhelming grief. The courtroom buzzed with hushed whispers as Isabella took the stand. Sunlight streamed through the tall windows, illuminating dust motes dancing in the air, a stark contrast to the shadow of Julian's guilt. He watched her, his breath catching in his throat. Her pregnancy, once a weapon in his eyes, now felt like a poignant symbol of his own self-destruction. Her voice, though trembling slightly, was clear and strong. "He fired me," she said, her gaze unwavering, "because I was pregnant. He accused me of trying to trap him." The words hung in the air, each syllable charged with unspoken pain. Julian felt a physical recoil, the accusation echoing in the silent chambers of his own heart. He saw the lawyer, Sarah, subtly nodding, a silent affirmation of Isabella's strength. Julian's stomach churned. He'd underestimated Isabella's resilience, just as he'd underestimated the depth of his own cruelty. The judge, a stern woman with sharp eyes, leaned forward. "And what was your response, Miss Davies?" Isabella paused, her hand unconsciously rising to touch her belly. "I was heartbroken, scared, but mostly I was angry. Angry at the injustice, at the sheer callousness." Her voice cracked, but she held firm. Julian felt a cold dread wash over him. This wasn't the fragile maid he'd dismissed. This was a woman fighting for her child, for her dignity, for her future. The next few hours were a blur of testimony, medical reports, and DNA evidence, all pointing to the undeniable truth. Julian sat rigid, the plush leather of his chair offering no comfort. He watched Isabella, her vulnerability laid bare, her strength a defiant flame against the storm of his creation. The judge's expression remained impassive, but the tightening of her lips betrayed her growing understanding. Each piece of evidence was a hammer blow against the edifice of his arrogance. As the court adjourned, a palpable shift had occurred. The silence was no longer tense. It was heavy with the weight of unveiled truth and looming judgment. Julian knew his life, his world, was irrevocably altered. He left the courtroom, a defeated man, the echoes of Isabella's testimony a relentless, unforgiving chorus in his ears. Julian's penthouse, usually a sanctuary of cool, minimalist luxury, felt like a suffocating cage. The city lights, usually a glittering backdrop to his success, now mocked him with their indifferent brilliance. Empty champagne flutes gathered dust on the polished mahogany bar, silent witnesses to his escalating despair. Sleep had become a fleeting visitor, replaced by a relentless cycle of self-recrimination. He'd reach for the phone, the impulse to call Isabella almost overwhelming, yet the fear of rejection held him back, a chilling paralysis gripping his soul. He stared at a framed photograph, a younger, carefree Julian with Isabella's mother, their laughter echoing across the years, a cruel reminder of his lost chance. Guilt, raw and visceral, clawed at him. The memory of Isabella's testimony, her quiet dignity, her unwavering strength, played on repeat in his mind, a constant, searing indictment. He poured himself another drink, the amber liquid burning a path down his throat, offering only momentary oblivion. The phone rang, jarring him from his reverie. He hesitated, then answered. "Thorne," he grated, his voice rough with exhaustion. "Mr. Thorne." Sarah's voice was calm, professional, but laced with a quiet understanding. I just wanted to check on you. The media frenzy is intense." "I'm aware," Julian muttered, swirling the remaining whiskey in his glass. "They're circling like vultures." A silence hung between them, heavy with unspoken anxieties. "Isabella, she's holding up," Sarah finally said, her voice softer now. "But the stress—" "I know," Julian interrupted, the words choked with regret. "The stress is unbearable." He realized, with a sickening jolt, that he was talking about her stress, not his own. He'd created this. He was the source of her suffering. "Take care of yourself, Mr. Thorne," Sarah said gently before hanging up. The line went dead, leaving Julian alone with the crushing weight of his actions. The stark realization that his empire, his reputation, his very life, was crumbling around him. The city outside roared, oblivious to the tempest raging within him. The quiet luxury of his penthouse offered no solace. Only the bitter taste of self-loathing and the chilling whisper of a future he'd destroyed. The mahogany bar, usually gleaming under the penthouse's soft lighting, felt cold and unforgiving beneath Julian's trembling hands. He stared at the swirling amber liquid in his glass, its warmth a stark contrast to the icy dread that gripped him. Sleepless nights had etched shadows under his eyes, deepening the lines of worry etched around his mouth. The city's relentless hum, usually a comforting backdrop to his opulent life, now felt like a mocking chorus of his failures. Sarah's words echoed in his ears. "The stress is unbearable." He'd uttered those words, yet the unbearable stress belonged to Isabella, a weight he'd inflicted. He picked up his phone, the cool glass a momentary distraction from the burning shame. He almost dialed Isabella's number, then hesitated. The fear of rejection, a familiar companion, held him paralyzed. He imagined her voice, the quiet strength he'd witnessed in court, now laced with bitterness. The image of her pregnant form, vulnerable yet resolute, haunted him. A knock on the door startled him. His heart pounded a frantic rhythm against his ribs. He braced himself, expecting another journalist, another barrage of accusations. But instead, it was his aging housekeeper, Mrs. Petrov, her face etched with concern. "Mr. Thorne," she said, her voice hushed. "There's a package." He took the package, a small, plain box. His hands trembled as he opened it, revealing a simple, hand-knitted baby blanket, the yarn soft and surprisingly warm. A small card lay beneath. "For the little one, from someone who wishes you peace." No name, only a simple, heartfelt message. Tears pricked his eyes. This anonymous act of kindness, this unexpected gesture, cracked the icy shell of his self-imposed isolation. The city lights, still glittering outside, suddenly seemed less mocking, less indifferent. A flicker of hope, fragile but real, ignited within him. The blanket felt warm against his skin, a tangible symbol of the warmth he'd so desperately craved and so carelessly destroyed. The weight of his actions remained, heavy and inescapable, but for the first time in days, a tiny crack appeared in the wall of his despair, allowing a single ray of light to penetrate the suffocating darkness. The biting wind whipped around Julian as he stumbled out of his penthouse, the city lights blurring through his alcohol-hazed vision. His tailored suit, usually a symbol of power, felt like a suffocating cage. The anonymous baby blanket, a small act of unexpected kindness, offered no lasting solace. He felt the familiar gnawing emptiness, the hollowness that money couldn't fill. He found himself drawn to the dimly lit streets, the anonymity a temporary refuge from his opulent, yet isolating life. The scent of rain mingled with exhaust fumes, a pungent reality check compared to the sterile fragrance of his penthouse. A stray dog whimpered nearby, its shivering body a mirror of his own internal turmoil. He stopped, the cold seeping into his bones. The weight of his actions pressed down, suffocating him. Isabella's face, etched with a mixture of pain and quiet strength, flashed before his eyes. He remembered her testimony, the raw vulnerability that had pierced his hardened heart. He'd heard the pain in her voice, the quiet dignity that shamed him to his core. A sudden gust of wind tore at his coat, a physical manifestation of his inner chaos. He wanted to scream, to lash out, to undo the damage he'd caused. But all that remained was a crushing weight of regret, a silent scream trapped in his chest. He sank onto a nearby bench, the cold seeping into his bones, a physical representation of the emotional frost that encased his heart. The city noises faded into a dull roar, replaced by the relentless pounding of his own guilt. He reached into his pocket, his fingers finding the crumpled card accompanying the blanket. The simple words, "For the little one, from someone who wishes you peace," echoed the silent plea in his own heart. Peace. He craved it, yearned for it, but knew it was a long, arduous journey away. The journey began not with grand gestures, but with small, hesitant steps. And the first step, he realized, was to stop running, to face himself, his past actions, and the devastating consequences. The dawn, pale and hesitant, crept over the horizon, offering a fragile promise of a new day, a new chance, a new beginning. The mahogany of his desk felt cold against Julian's skin. Each meticulously crafted detail, the inlaid mother of pearl, the polished finish, mocked his current state. Sleepless nights had etched shadows under his eyes, deepening the lines of his usually impassive face. The city, usually a vibrant tapestry viewed from his penthouse, now felt like a relentless, judgmental eye. He swirled the amber liquid in his glass, the expensive scotch doing little to soothe the burning in his throat. It was a burning mirrored by the gnawing guilt that consumed him. His phone buzzed, the insistent vibration a jarring counterpoint to the quiet desperation of his self-imposed exile. He ignored it, the silence preferable to the barrage of calls from lawyers, concerned shareholders, and a relentless media. He was a pariah, his carefully constructed empire crumbling around him, brick by agonizing brick. The taste of ash filled his mouth, the bitter residue of his own making. He stared at a framed photograph, a younger, carefree Julian, arm in arm with Isabella's mother, laughter etched on their faces. The image, a painful reminder of a life unlived, a choice made and a life irrevocably altered, brought a fresh wave of nausea. He slammed the glass onto the desk, the sharp sound echoing the turmoil within. A low sob escaped him. It was a sound he hadn't heard in decades, a sound that felt both alien and intimately familiar. He hadn't realized how much he had suppressed, how much he had buried until the truth had clawed its way to the surface. The man in the mirror was a stranger, a husk of the ambitious, ruthless businessman he once was. The mask had slipped, revealing a man consumed by regret, by a profound, gut-wrenching loneliness. The city lights, once symbols of his success, now seemed to mock him with their cold indifference. He needed help desperately. The realization hit him like a physical blow, the first crack in the impenetrable wall he'd built around his heart. He picked up the phone, his hand trembling. The number for the therapist he'd reluctantly agreed to see was already programmed. The dial tone sounded loud in the sudden, heavy silence. This was just the beginning, a first, tentative step on a road that promised to be long and arduous. But it was a step nonetheless, toward acknowledging the catastrophic errors he had made, toward attempting to salvage what little remained. The morning light, weak and hesitant, filtered through the gauzy curtains of Isabella's small apartment. The air hung heavy with the scent of chamomile tea and the faint, sweet perfume of lilies, a gift from her sister. Her hands, swollen with pregnancy, rested on her burgeoning belly. A wave of nausea, familiar now, washed over her. The fear, a constant companion these past months, tightened its icy grip. A soft knock at the door. It was Mrs. Gable, a former employee of Julian Thorne's, her face etched with a kindness that felt both surprising and comforting. "Morning, dear," Mrs. Gable said, her voice soft as a summer breeze. I brought you some oatmeal, and some of those ginger snaps your sister raved about. Isabella managed a weak smile. Thank you, Mrs. Gable. You really didn't have to. Nonsense, Mrs. Gable replied, her eyes twinkling. Mr. Thorne may be difficult, but not everyone who works for him is heartless. You deserve all the support you can get. The mention of Julian's name sparked a flicker of resentment, quickly extinguished by a weary sigh. The weight of the past few months, the legal battles, the constant fear, had left her emotionally drained. The joy of expecting her child was constantly overshadowed by the bitterness of her father's cruelty. Yet, a small, fragile ember of hope flickered within her. Mrs. Gable's unexpected kindness was a balm to her wounded spirit, a testament that not all connections with Julian's world were toxic. The ginger snaps, a simple gesture, felt like a lifeline in the storm of her emotions. The warmth of the oatmeal, the comforting scent of the spices, soothed her queasy stomach. It was more than just food. It was a reminder of simple human kindness, a small victory in a battle that felt impossibly large. For now, the quiet comfort of her small apartment, the unexpected support, offered a brief respite from the turmoil that still raged within. The future remained uncertain, but in this moment, the weight of the world felt a little lighter. The sterile scent of antiseptic clung to the air in Isabella's doctor's office, a stark contrast to the floral perfume of the lilies Mrs. Gable had brought. Isabella nervously smoothed her maternity dress, the fabric a pale reflection of her own drained complexion. The ultrasound screen flickered, displaying a tiny, perfect image of her daughter. A wave of bittersweet emotion washed over her, joy warring with the shadow of Julian's cruelty. Dr. Ramirez's voice was soft, professional, yet laced with concern. The baby is healthy, Isabella. Strong heartbeat, excellent growth. But your blood pressure is still elevated. The stress, it's taking its toll. Isabella's eyes stung. I know, she whispered, her voice tight with unshed tears. It's hard. Everything is hard. The doctor nodded sympathetically. Try to rest, Isabella. Focus on your health and on the beautiful baby you're carrying. And remember, she added, her tone gentler now, you're not alone. Later, curled on her worn sofa, the ultrasound picture clutched in her hand, Isabella allowed herself to cry. The tears came in ragged sobs, a release of pent-up fear and anger. The image of her unborn child, a tiny promise of a future she desperately wanted to protect, mingled with the searing pain of her father's rejection. The guilt gnawed at her. She should be overjoyed, but a bitter knot of resentment persisted. A gentle knock. It was Mrs. Gable again, a plate of warm soup in her hands. I heard from Sarah, Mrs. Gable said, her voice hushed, stepping inside. The judge is leaning towards your favor. They're considering the DNA evidence strongly. Hope, fragile yet tenacious, stirred within Isabella. Really? Her voice was barely a whisper, a question hanging in the air, heavy with years of unspoken pain. Do you think he'll apologize? Mrs. Gable sat beside her, her hand resting gently on Isabella's arm. He may, she said softly, but apologies don't always heal everything. Focus on what you need, Isabella. Your daughter, your health, your future. The soup warmed Isabella from the inside, a small comfort in the face of overwhelming uncertainty. The fight was far from over, but in the quiet strength of Mrs. Gable's unwavering kindness, she found a renewed resolve. The weight of the world still pressed down, but for now, the tiny image in her hand and the warmth of a simple act of compassion offered a flicker of light in the darkness. The late afternoon sun cast long shadows across Isabella's small apartment, painting the walls in hues of orange and purple. The air, thick with the scent of simmering soup and lavender from Mrs. Gable's recent visit, offered a fragile comfort. Isabella traced the outline of the ultrasound picture, the tiny form of her daughter a potent mix of joy and trepidation. The doctor's words echoed in her ears. The stress, it's taking its toll. The stress wasn't just physical. It was the relentless weight of Julian Thorne's cruelty, a burden that threatened to suffocate her. A soft knock interrupted her reverie. Sarah, her lawyer, stood in the doorway, her usual brisk energy tempered with a quiet concern. "The judge wants to meet with both of you tomorrow morning," she announced, her voice low. "He wants a private mediation session." Isabella's stomach clenched. A mediation session. The thought of facing Julian again, of being in the same room, sent a shiver down her spine. I don't know if I can," she whispered, her voice barely audible. Sarah knelt beside her, her hand resting gently on Isabella's arm. "You don't have to face him alone," she reassured her. "I'll be there, and we have a strong case. Remember that." Her voice held a strength that Isabella desperately needed. The thought of the strength of their case, the evidence, did give Isabella a little more courage. "The DNA evidence," she murmured, touching the ultrasound photo again. A silent vow to fight for her daughter's future. The judge's decision seemed so much more important now that her child was healthy and growing. She needed more than money. She needed acknowledgement, a recognition of what had been done to her and her family. This was no longer just about herself. It was about protecting her child. It was about finally being seen. That night, sleep eluded Isabella. The image of Julian's cold, indifferent eyes haunted her dreams. Yet, amidst the fear and anger, a tiny seed of hope sprouted. Maybe, just maybe, this mediation would offer a chance for him to finally see her, to understand. Or perhaps, she thought with a chilling premonition, it was a chance for him to reiterate his callous actions, to further inflict his damage. The uncertainty was almost worse than the certain pain of his rejection. The humid summer air hung heavy in Isabella's small apartment. Sunlight, filtered through dusty blinds, cast long shadows across the worn floral carpet. The scent of lavender, a lingering memory of Mrs. Gable's visit, battled with the metallic tang of anxiety clinging to Isabella's skin. Her pregnancy, once a source of hopeful joy, now felt burdened by the looming shadow of the lawsuit and the relentless weight of Julian Thorne's cruelty. A soft sob escaped her lips, a silent tremor in the quiet afternoon. She clutched the ultrasound picture, the tiny profile a potent symbol of her fight. The doctor's warning, the stress was harming her, echoed in her mind. But the stress wasn't just physical. It was the emotional toll of Julian's callous rejection, the denial of her very existence. A hesitant knock at the door startled her. It was Martha, a former employee of Thorne Industries, her face etched with a surprising kindness. I heard things were difficult," Martha began, her voice low and hesitant. She held a basket brimming with fresh fruit and vegetables. "My husband, he's a baker, and he made you some cookies." Isabella's eyes welled up. "Thank you," she whispered, her voice thick with emotion. "Thank you so much." Martha's unexpected kindness felt like a lifeline in the suffocating despair. They sat together, sharing quiet moments, the gentle clinking of teacups a soothing counterpoint to the turmoil in Isabella's heart. Martha listened patiently as Isabella poured out her fears, her anger, her deep-seated hurt. "He'll never understand," Isabella murmured, despair coloring her voice. "He'll never truly see what he's done." Martha's hand rested on Isabella's arm, a silent gesture of comfort. "Some people," she said softly, "take a long time to see the truth, but even the coldest hearts can change." Her words were a fragile seed of hope, a tentative counterpoint to the bitterness Isabella felt. The support, unexpected and genuine, gave Isabella a flicker of courage, a new source of strength to continue her fight. The battle was far from over, but in that shared moment, a small crack appeared in the wall of despair, letting in a sliver of light. The mahogany door of Julian Thorne's penthouse apartment felt heavy under Julian's trembling hand. Inside, the air hung thick with the scent of expensive leather and stale regret. He hadn't slept properly in weeks, the image of Isabella's fragile face, etched with hurt, haunting his every waking moment. He'd rehearsed this visit countless times, the apology carefully crafted, yet the words felt hollow, inadequate. He found Isabella in her small, sun-drenched apartment, the air filled with the gentle aroma of baking bread. She looked thinner, the shadows under her eyes deeper than before. She was holding a book, a children's story, its brightly colored cover a stark contrast to the pallor of her skin. "Isabella?" he began, his voice a low rumble, unfamiliar even to his own ears. The sound of his name seemed to startle her. She looked up, her eyes wide, filled with a mixture of wariness and pain. "Mr. Thorne," she replied, her voice barely a whisper. The simple formality, a wall between them, stung him. He sat down, the plush armchair feeling strangely out of place in her modest living room. I came to apologize," he stammered, the words catching in his throat. "For everything." Isabella remained silent, her gaze fixed on the worn rug at her feet. The silence stretched, heavy and suffocating, punctuated only by the distant hum of the city. "I know an apology isn't enough," Julian continued, his voice cracking. "But I wanted you to know. I understand now. I see what I did. I destroyed something precious." He reached out, his hand hovering over hers, then quickly retracting it, a flinch of fear at his own audacity. The unspoken question hung between them. Could this broken bridge be mended? Could the chasm of his past cruelty ever be bridged by a single, halting apology? The weight of his past actions, the stark reality of his rejection, pressed down on him with crushing force. The journey towards reconciliation had begun, but the path ahead was long and uncertain, fraught with the lingering shadows of his past. The stale air of the hospital waiting room clung to Julian like a shroud. He watched Isabella from across the room, her face pale but serene, cradling a tiny bundle wrapped in a soft, pink blanket. The scent of antiseptic fought with the faint sweetness of baby powder. He saw the exhaustion etched into her features, the subtle tremor in her hand as she adjusted the blanket. His heart ached. This was his granddaughter, a tiny being he'd almost denied existence. He approached cautiously, his footsteps echoing in the hushed environment. Isabella's eyes flickered up, a flicker of surprise, then apprehension. She didn't look away, though. "She's beautiful," he whispered, his voice hoarse. The words felt inadequate, a pathetic attempt to bridge the vast gulf between them. Isabella met his gaze, her expression unreadable. A single tear traced a path down her cheek. "Yes," she breathed, her voice barely audible. The silence hung heavy between them, thick with unspoken words, years of pain and regret. He shifted uncomfortably, the weight of his past actions pressing down on him. I wanted to see her," he said, the words clumsy and inadequate. He longed to reach out, to touch the tiny hand peeking from the blanket, but he hesitated, afraid to scare her away. Isabella looked down at her daughter, her lips curving into a faint smile. "Her name is Lily," she said softly, her voice gaining a little strength. "Lily Thorne." The name, spoken so simply, resonated deep within him. Lily Thorne, his granddaughter. The weight of responsibility settled on his shoulders, a heavy but not unwelcome burden. The journey to reconciliation was far from over, but in that small, quiet moment, in the sterile environment of the hospital waiting room, a fragile seed of hope had been planted. The future remained uncertain, but in the face of his newborn granddaughter, Julian felt, for the first time in a long time, a glimmer of peace. The sterile scent of antiseptic hung heavy in the air, a stark contrast to the soft, downy smell of Lily's hair. Julian watched Isabella, her face etched with exhaustion but radiating a quiet joy as she cradled their granddaughter. He felt a pang of guilt, so sharp it stole his breath. This tiny being, this perfect miniature of Isabella, was the living embodiment of his cruelty, a constant reminder of his past mistakes. He approached hesitantly, each step a careful negotiation across the chasm of his own making. Isabella's eyes met his, a flicker of apprehension before settling into a guarded stillness. The silence stretched, thick and suffocating. He longed to speak, to offer some semblance of an apology, but the words caught in his throat. Finally, He managed a choked whisper, "She's beautiful." Isabella's gaze softened fractionally, a single tear tracing a path through the faint dusting of powder on her cheek. "Yes," she breathed, her voice barely above a whisper. The word hung in the air, heavy with unspoken emotions. Years of hurt, of betrayal, of injustice. He saw the conflict mirrored in her eyes, the overwhelming love for her child warring with the deep wound he had inflicted. He wanted to reach out, to touch the tiny hand peeking from the blanket, but fear held him back. The fear of rejection, of being pushed away again. The silence stretched, punctuated only by the rhythmic beeping of a heart monitor in the distance. He cleared his throat, attempting a different approach. I wanted to see her." The words were clumsy, inadequate, mirroring his own clumsy attempts at reconciliation. He longed for a smoother path, a way to bridge the gulf between them, but years of arrogance had left him ill-equipped. He felt stripped bare, exposed in his vulnerability. The weight of his past actions pressed down on him, a heavy cloak of regret. Isabella looked down at Lily, a faint smile gracing her lips. "Her name is Lily," she murmured, her voice gaining strength. Lily Thorne. The name, spoken so simply, resonated within him, a tremor of hope amidst the wreckage of his past. Lily Thorne, his granddaughter. The weight of responsibility settled heavily upon his shoulders, a burden he felt he deserved to bear. The journey toward reconciliation was arduous, a steep, rocky climb. Yet, in that sterile hospital room, under the fluorescent lights, a tiny seed of hope had taken root. The afternoon sun cast long shadows across the worn floral wallpaper of Isabella's small apartment. Dust motes danced in the golden light, illuminating the quiet tension hanging between her and Julian. He sat stiffly on the edge of a worn armchair, a bouquet of lilies, ironically, clutched awkwardly in his lap. The lilies, a gesture of peace perhaps, felt more like a symbol of his misplaced wealth. I came to apologize," Julian began, his voice a low rumble, unfamiliar even to his own ears. The words felt inadequate, clumsy, like a child's attempt at building a castle from sand. Isabella remained silent, her gaze fixed on the chipped paint of the windowsill. The silence stretched, heavy with the weight of unspoken accusations, years of pain. The scent of lilies, sweet and cloying, clashed with the faint aroma of simmering stew, a homely contrast to the opulent life Julian inhabited. He shifted uncomfortably, the lilies wilting slightly in his grip. "I understand. If you can't forgive me," he continued, his voice catching slightly. He hadn't anticipated the raw emotion of this moment, the sudden vulnerability that threatened to overwhelm him. He'd anticipated anger, rejection. This quiet, icy distance was far more devastating. Isabella finally looked at him, her eyes, usually soft and warm, now held a glacial hardness. "Understanding isn't enough, Mr. Thorne," she said, her voice low and steady. "Understanding doesn't change the fact that you threw me away like trash, that you treated me with such contempt, that you almost cost me everything." She touched her rounded belly protectively, a small tremor in her voice betraying her underlying fear. Julian flinched, the weight of his actions pressing down on him. He saw the pain etched in her face, the resilience masked by exhaustion. It was a stark contrast to his own carefully constructed world of denial. The scent of lilies suddenly felt suffocating. His apology, so meticulously crafted, felt pathetically insufficient. He swallowed, a bitter taste lingering on his tongue. "I know," he whispered, his voice barely audible. "I know I was wrong." The words, though simple, felt like the first steps on a long, arduous journey toward redemption. A journey he was now prepared to undertake, no matter how difficult the path. The silence held, thick with unspoken emotions, promising a long and complex road ahead. The weight of his actions pressed down on Julian like a physical burden. He'd left Isabella's apartment, the scent of lilies a bitter reminder of his inadequate apology. The city lights blurred through his rain-streaked car window, mirroring the chaotic storm raging within him. His penthouse, usually a sanctuary of opulent comfort, felt cold and empty. The vast space mocked his solitude. He poured himself a whiskey, the amber liquid doing little to soothe the burning guilt. The ice clinked harshly in the glass, a counterpoint to the silent accusations echoing in his mind. He picked up his phone, the illuminated screen a stark contrast to the shadows clinging to the corners of his room. He scrolled through news articles, each headline a fresh wound. Thorn Empire faces backlash. Billionaire's daughter speaks out. The public condemnation was brutal, yet somehow it felt deserved. He deserved this fall. Days bled into weeks. The initial shock gave way to a gnawing self-loathing. He found himself staring at his reflection, a stranger gazing back from the polished surface, a man stripped bare of his arrogance, his carefully constructed facade crumbling. The therapy sessions were excruciating, each revelation a fresh layer of pain peeled away. Dr. Anya Sharma, his therapist, a woman whose empathy cut through his hardened defenses, had encouraged him to confront his past. He began to understand his fear of vulnerability, its roots buried deep in a childhood marked by neglect. He saw now how his ambition had been a shield, a way to avoid facing his own insecurities. It had cost him everything. He felt a flicker of hope, though fragile. A small spark ignited by the thought of Isabella, her quiet strength, her resilience in the face of his cruelty. He knew he had a long way to go, a mountain of regret to climb. But he was starting. The climb was beginning. He reached for the phone again, a new resolve settling within him. This time he wasn't dialing for a lawyer or a damage control specialist. He was dialing Isabella's number. The sterile scent of antiseptic hung heavy in the air as Julian sat across from Dr. Sharma. He'd arrived late, the city's relentless pulse still thrumming in his ears, a discordant counterpoint to the quiet hum of the therapist's office. He hadn't slept properly in weeks, haunted by Isabella's face, the quiet dignity etched onto her features during her testimony. "I keep replaying it, doctor," he confessed, his voice rough. Her vulnerability, her strength, it was terrifying. Dr. Sharma nodded gently, her gaze understanding. "The confrontation with your past self, perhaps?" she offered softly. He traced the rim of his empty coffee cup, the ceramic cool against his trembling fingers. The weight of his actions pressed down on him, the casual cruelty, the careless dismissal, the willful blindness to the truth. "I fired her," he whispered, the words a bitter taste on his tongue. "My own daughter, pregnant." The shame was a physical entity, suffocating him. The rain outside had intensified, drumming a relentless rhythm against the window pane. He imagined Isabella, cocooned within her small apartment, the scent of lilies perhaps a fragile counterpoint to the storm raging outside and within her. He yearned to reach out, to offer more than hollow words, but fear held him back, a familiar, crippling paralysis. "I don't deserve forgiveness," he muttered, the words lost in the drumming rain. "But I need to try." Dr. Sharma's voice cut through his self-recrimination. "Trying is the first step, Mr. Thorne. Acceptance of your actions, however painful, is crucial. Only then can you begin to mend the damage." Her words, though simple, struck him with a force that surprised him. He looked out at the rain-lashed city, a city he had once controlled with an iron fist, now feeling small and utterly lost. He had a long way to go, but for the first time, he saw the faintest glimmer of a path through the storm. A path leading, perhaps, towards redemption. The sterile hospital room smelled faintly of antiseptic and lilies. Isabella, pale but serene, cradled her newborn daughter, a tiny bundle of pink perfection. The baby's soft sighs punctuated the silence, a fragile counterpoint to the turmoil in Julian's heart. He stood near the window, the city lights a blurry, indifferent sprawl below. He'd come, driven by a desperate need to see her, to see them. But the distance felt insurmountable. He hadn't dared approach. He watched Isabella's hand, delicate and tired, gently stroking the baby's cheek. The scene was a stark contrast to the icy boardrooms he usually inhabited. A wave of nausea, not unlike the one he'd felt during his therapy sessions, washed over him. This tiny life, this innocent face, it was the culmination of his cruelty, a living testament to his mistakes. "She has your eyes?" Sarah's voice, soft and steady, broke through his reverie. She stood beside him, her presence a quiet comfort. Julian nodded, his throat too tight to speak. He saw it now, the familiar glint of defiance, a spark of his own stubbornness, mirrored in the baby's gaze. The sight pierced him, a raw and unexpected pain. "She's beautiful," he finally managed, his voice a hoarse whisper. Sarah smiled sadly. "Yes, she is." A long silence stretched between them, thick with unspoken emotions. Julian knew an apology was expected, perhaps demanded, but the words eluded him, strangled by guilt and the crushing weight of his past actions. He felt the sting of tears behind his eyes, a sudden, unexpected release. This wasn't just about Isabella anymore. It was about the fractured pieces of his own soul, the irreparable damage he had inflicted. The city lights blurred further, his vision clouded with unshed tears. He needed to find a way to bridge the chasm he had created, not just for Isabella's sake, but for his own redemption, for the sake of this fragile, perfect baby girl. He took a deep breath, the city air suddenly sharp and cold against his lungs. It was time to begin. The sterile scent of the hospital clung to Julian like a second skin. He sat in the waiting room, the polished chrome chairs reflecting the sterile, cold light. Each tick of the clock echoed the relentless drumming of guilt in his chest. He hadn't slept properly in weeks, the image of Isabella's tear-streaked face haunting his dreams. He'd started volunteering at the city's largest homeless shelter, the repetitive, grueling work a dull ache compared to the sharp pain of his regret. The fluorescent lights buzzed overhead, a jarring contrast to the hushed whispers of the other families. He traced the worn seam of his expensive suit, the fabric feeling alien against his skin. He felt a strange detachment, as if observing his own life as a detached observer. He'd always controlled his environment, but now, the chaotic uncertainty of his situation felt suffocating. Sarah found him there, her presence as calming as a summer rain. "She's doing well," she said, her voice a gentle balm. "The baby, she's perfect." Julian nodded, his throat tight. He wanted to ask about Isabella, to apologize again, but the words caught in his throat. The weight of his past actions felt too immense. "She's asked to see you," Sarah continued, her gaze understanding. "But she needs time." The news hit him like a physical blow. He had expected rejection, had braced himself for Isabella's anger, but the measured tone of Sarah's voice, hopeful yet cautious, struck a nerve. It was a sliver of possibility, a fragile tendril of hope in the wasteland of his self-destruction. The weight on his chest, though still heavy, felt slightly less crushing. The long wait, the cold sterility of the room, the buzzing lights, none of it seemed as insurmountable anymore. He could almost feel the warmth of the hope it represented. He knew he still had a long way to go, but this was a beginning. The sterile scent of antiseptic gave way to the sweeter smell of baby powder as a nurse wheeled Isabella into the room. Julian watched from the hallway, hidden behind a potted fern, the lush green leaves a stark contrast to the cold, clinical environment. He saw her, pale but radiant, cradling a tiny, swaddled form. A wave of emotion, so potent it almost buckled his knees, washed over him. Guilt, regret, and a fierce, desperate yearning for connection threatened to overwhelm him. He'd imagined this moment countless times, but the reality was far more profound, far more devastatingly beautiful. Isabella's eyes, usually bright and full of life, held a haunted quality. Postpartum depression clung to her like a shroud, a chilling reminder of the emotional turmoil she'd endured. He saw her glance towards the doorway, a flicker of something unreadable in her gaze. Fear? Curiosity? Or was it merely the exhaustion that shadowed her features? He wanted to approach her, to offer words of comfort, but his feet felt rooted to the spot. The distance between them seemed insurmountable, a chasm carved by his own cruelty. A soft whimper escaped Isabella's lips, and Julian's heart lurched. The tiny sounds of a baby's contented sigh filled the silence that followed, a bittersweet melody that cut through the thick layer of his guilt. He watched as a tear traced a path down Isabella's cheek, stopping abruptly as a small hand wrapped around her finger. The raw, unfiltered emotion of that moment pierced him to the core. He felt the years of his self-imposed isolation crumble under the weight of his newfound responsibility. It was more than just regret. It was the painful awareness of the family he'd almost destroyed. And in that moment, seeing his granddaughter's tiny hand, a spark of hope, fragile but tenacious, ignited within him. The fight for reconciliation had only just begun. The sterile hospital room hummed with the low thrum of unseen machinery. Sunlight, filtered through the pale curtains, cast long shadows across the polished floor. Isabella, pale but holding her newborn daughter close, looked utterly exhausted. The baby, a tiny bundle of pink and white, slept soundly, her breath a soft rhythm against Isabella's chest. The air was thick with the scent of antiseptic and the faint sweetness of baby powder, a stark contrast to the bitter taste lingering in Isabella's mouth. Postpartum depression threatened to swallow her whole. Julian stood in the hallway, unseen, his reflection a blurry ghost in the polished stainless steel of a distant cart. He clutched a small, plush lamb, a gift he'd chosen impulsively, a pathetic attempt at amends. He longed to approach, to offer comfort, but fear held him captive. His heart pounded a frantic rhythm against his ribs. He had envisioned this moment 1,000 times, yet the reality was both overwhelming and terrifyingly fragile. He watched Isabella's gaze drift towards the doorway, a flicker of something, fear, perhaps, or guarded hope, crossing her face. He knew he was an unwelcome shadow, a ghost from her past, a specter of pain. The weight of his past actions pressed down on him, a suffocating blanket of guilt. He whispered, "She's beautiful, Isabella," his voice barely a breath. Isabella flinched, her eyes widening slightly. Her lips trembled, but she didn't speak. The silence stretched, taut and heavy with unspoken emotions. The tiny sighs of the sleeping baby punctuated the stillness, a fragile counterpoint to the storm raging within them both. He took a tentative step closer, then stopped, the plush lamb feeling heavy in his hand. I wanted to." He struggled for the right words, the carefully rehearsed apologies dissolving into a clumsy mess. Isabella's gaze, finally meeting his, held a depth of sorrow that pierced him. A single tear traced a slow path down her cheek, a silent testament to the pain she had endured. Yet, something else flickered within her eyes, a spark of weary acceptance, maybe, or a faint glimmer of something resembling forgiveness. He knew this wouldn't be a swift resolution, a simple exchange of apologies and forgiveness. This was the beginning of a long, arduous journey, a path paved with small acts of kindness, hesitant gestures, and the painstaking work of rebuilding trust. But in that moment, watching his daughter and granddaughter, he felt a spark of hope ignite within him, a tenacious flame flickering in the darkness of his past. The fight for reconciliation had begun. The sterile scent of antiseptic clung to Isabella's clothes, a stark contrast to the sweet baby powder dusting her daughter's skin. Postpartum exhaustion weighed heavily. Each breath felt like an effort. Julian watched from the doorway, the tiny lamb clutched in his hand feeling ridiculously inadequate. He'd imagined this moment countless times, yet the reality was a raw, visceral experience that stripped away his carefully constructed defenses. "She's beautiful," he whispered, his voice cracking. Isabella flinched, her eyes, dark with shadows, widening slightly. A single tear traced a path down her cheek, mirroring the silent torrent of emotions she fought to contain. She didn't speak, the silence stretching, taut with unspoken accusations and fragile hope. The baby stirred, a tiny gurgling sound breaking the tension. He took a tentative step closer, the plush lamb suddenly feeling heavy, a symbol of his clumsy attempts at atonement. I wanted to." His carefully rehearsed apology faltered, reduced to a stammering mess. He wanted to reach out, to touch her hand, to offer some tangible expression of his remorse. But fear paralyzed him. Her gaze finally met his, and in its depths he saw a vast ocean of pain, a landscape scarred by his past cruelty. Yet, something else flickered, a faint glimmer of weariness, of acceptance. It wasn't forgiveness, not yet, but a crack in the hardened wall she'd built around her heart. The weight of his actions pressed down on him, suffocating. He saw his reflection in the polished surface of a nearby medical cart, a ghost of a man haunted by regret. This wouldn't be a swift reconciliation, he knew. This was a long, slow climb, a journey paved with hesitant gestures and small acts of kindness. But in that moment, looking at his daughter and his granddaughter, sleeping soundly in Isabella's arms, a fragile hope bloomed amidst the ruins of his past. The fight for reconciliation had begun, a battle fought not with words, but with quiet acts of devotion and the relentless pursuit of forgiveness. The nursery was a haven of pastel blues and yellows, a stark contrast to the sterile hospital room. Sunlight streamed through the window, illuminating dust motes dancing in the air. Isabella, pale and exhausted, nursed her daughter, a tiny bundle of pink perfection nestled against her. The baby's soft sighs filled the quiet room, a soothing counterpoint to the turmoil in Isabella's heart. Postpartum depression clung to her like a shadow, whispering doubts and fears. Julian stood by the window, a silent observer. The tiny, perfect hand clutching his finger was a miracle, a tangible connection to the daughter and granddaughter he'd almost lost. He watched Isabella, her face etched with a weariness that went beyond simple exhaustion. He ached to comfort her, to bridge the chasm between them, but the weight of his past actions held him back. He cleared his throat, the sound sharp in the quiet room. "She's beautiful." Isabella didn't look up, her gaze fixed on the sleeping infant. Her voice was barely a whisper. "Yes." A silence stretched between them, thick and heavy with unspoken emotions. Julian wanted to say so much, to apologize, to explain, to beg for forgiveness. But the words seemed inadequate, hollow. He picked up a soft, knitted blanket, his fingers clumsy and unsure. He draped it gently over the baby. "She's so small," he murmured, his voice hoarse with emotion. The simple statement was a confession, a recognition of his own fragility in the face of this new reality. He felt the pull of a profound love for this tiny human being, a love that threatened to shatter the barriers he had so carefully constructed around his heart. Isabella finally looked up, her eyes, though shadowed with exhaustion, held a flicker of something akin to acceptance. Not forgiveness, not yet, but perhaps a tentative opening. The weight of his past actions remained, a heavy burden he would carry for the rest of his life. But in this small, sunlit nursery, amidst the gentle sounds of a sleeping baby, a single ray of hope pierced through the darkness. The long road to reconciliation had begun. The mahogany desk in his sprawling office felt colder than usual. Julian traced the grain with a finger, the polished surface mirroring his own haggard reflection. The news reports, a relentless barrage of condemnation, swam behind his eyelids. He hadn't slept properly in weeks. The foundation, a gesture born of guilt and a desperate need for redemption, was taking shape, a monument to his failings and a prayer for forgiveness. It was a massive undertaking, requiring the mobilization of his considerable resources. Yet it felt insignificant, a tiny drop in the vast ocean of his regret. He thought of Isabella, her pale face, the weariness etched into her features. The baby's tiny hand, wrapped around his finger, the image burned into his memory. He picked up the phone, his hand trembling slightly. The number was etched in his mind. He hesitated, then dialed. The ringing tone echoed in the vast emptiness of his office. Finally, a voice, soft and hesitant, answered. "Hello, Isabella," he began, his voice rough. It's Julian." A pause, filled with silence heavy with unspoken accusations and years of hurt. Then, a quiet, almost inaudible, "Yes, I wanted to apologize. Not just for the termination, but for everything. For my arrogance, my blindness, The words tumbled out, a torrent of remorse. He felt the tears welling in his eyes, the years of denial crumbling like sand. "I've started a foundation," he continued, his voice cracking slightly, "for single mothers, to help them to make amends." Another pause. Then, Isabella's voice, though still quiet, held a sliver of something that sounded almost curious. "A foundation?" "Yes," Julian said, his voice steadier now, fueled by a desperate need for understanding. "It's just a start. I know it can't undo what I've done, but—" He trailed off, the inadequacy of his words crushing him. "I want to help. I want to be a part of your daughter's life." The words hung in the air, fragile, hopeful. The silence stretched, heavy with the weight of the past and the tentative promise of the future. The phone remained connected, a lifeline between two shattered lives, desperately seeking a way to mend. The sterile scent of antiseptic hung heavy in the air, a stark contrast to the earthy sweetness of the newborn baby nestled in Isabella's arms. Sunlight streamed through the hospital window, illuminating dust motes dancing in the golden rays. From a shadowed corner, Julian watched. He hadn't dared approach, his presence a silent, looming question mark. The tiny hand, impossibly small, curled around a finger, a mirror of the image that had haunted his dreams. Isabella's face, etched with exhaustion but softened by a profound love, was a landscape of conflicting emotions. The postpartum depression threatened to engulf her, a dark tide threatening to drown the joy of motherhood. She looked so fragile, so vulnerable, a stark reminder of the cruelty he'd inflicted. A wave of nausea washed over him, the familiar sting of guilt sharper than ever. He wanted to reach out, to offer comfort, to somehow atone for his actions. But the fear of rejection paralyzed him. He knew he didn't deserve her forgiveness. Not yet. His phone vibrated in his pocket, a reminder of the Foundation's burgeoning success. A small victory in the vast battle for redemption. The irony wasn't lost on him. His wealth, once a source of pride, now felt like a heavy weight, a symbol of his past mistakes. Later, Sarah, her face etched with concern, found him in the hospital cafeteria, sipping lukewarm coffee. "He's doing better, you know," she said quietly, her voice soft but firm. "The baby girl is healthy, but Isabella, she needs support, more than just financial." Julian nodded, his gaze fixed on the swirling coffee in his cup. "I know," he whispered, the words raspy with unshed tears. "I know. I'm trying." He looked up, meeting Sarah's understanding eyes. "I want to be a part of their lives, but I don't know how to approach it." He paused, searching for the right words. "I want to earn their trust." Sarah smiled gently. "It'll take time, Julian, but it's a start. You've taken the first steps. Now it's about showing them, not just telling them." She placed a reassuring hand on his arm. "Be patient, be present. Let them lead the way." He looked at Sarah, and a sliver of hope, fragile as a newborn's breath, pierced the darkness within him. The Foundation was a step, a tangible action, but what he truly needed was their acceptance. He was ready to make amends, to earn his place in this family, even if it took a lifetime. The road to forgiveness would be long and arduous, but for the first time, he felt a glimmer of light amidst the darkness. The sterile scent of the hospital faded as Julian stepped out into the crisp autumn air. Leaves, the color of burnt umber and fiery gold, crunched under his expensive shoes, a jarring contrast to the hushed reverence of the maternity ward. He felt the weight of his past decisions, heavy as a lead cloak. He'd established the Foundation, a gesture meant to atone, yet it felt insufficient, a paltry offering for the chasm of hurt he'd created. He pulled out his phone, the screen illuminating a picture of Isabella and the baby. The tiny face, framed by a wisp of dark hair, was a mirror of his own features, a stark reminder of his negligence. A wave of guilt washed over him, bitter and sharp. He needed to do more than just provide financial support. He needed to earn their forgiveness, their trust. He needed to be a father, a grandfather. Days bled into weeks. Julian found himself drawn to the park near Isabella's apartment building. He'd sit on a bench, watching from a distance, his heart aching with a mixture of hope and trepidation. He observed Isabella's hesitant smiles, the soft way she cradled the baby. He saw her struggle, the dark shadows under her eyes hinting at the postpartum depression Sarah had mentioned. He yearned to approach to offer help, but fear held him back. One afternoon, he saw Isabella struggling with the stroller, its wheel caught in a crack in the pavement. He hesitated for only a moment before approaching. "Let me help you with that," he offered, his voice barely above a whisper. Isabella looked up, her eyes widening in surprise. For a long moment, neither spoke, the only sound the rustling of leaves. "Thank you," she finally said, her voice soft, still tinged with a lingering bitterness. There was no anger, no explosion of resentment, only a quiet, guarded acceptance. He helped her free the stroller, his hands trembling slightly as their fingers brushed. "How is she?" he asked, gesturing towards the baby. "She's good," Isabella replied, a hint of a smile playing on her lips. "She's growing." The brief exchange held a delicate balance of acceptance and distance, of shared grief and cautious hope. He saw in her eyes a flicker of recognition, of a shared connection that transcended his past mistakes. The journey to reconciliation had begun, one hesitant step at a time. The crisp autumn air bit at Julian's cheeks as he drove past Isabella's apartment building. He'd been visiting the park across the street daily, a silent observer of their lives. Today, though, a different urge propelled him. He parked, the engine's hum a jarring contrast to the quiet residential street. He inhaled deeply, the scent of wood smoke and damp earth filling his lungs, a familiar comfort in this unfamiliar landscape of remorse. He walked towards the building, each step deliberate, each breath a conscious effort to calm the tremor in his hands. He rang the doorbell, the chime echoing the nervousness in his chest. He saw Isabella through the peephole, her eyes wide with a mixture of surprise and apprehension. The door opened slowly, revealing a glimpse of the baby's bassinet nestled beside a comfortable armchair. "Julian," she breathed, her voice barely a whisper. The shadows under her eyes were still deep, but a faint smile played on her lips. "Isabella," he replied, his own voice hoarse. He shifted his weight, unsure of what to say. I wanted to see her." He gestured towards the bassinet, his gaze fixed on the sleeping infant. The tiny fist clenched around a soft, blue blanket, a miniature replica of his own hands. Isabella stepped aside, her movements hesitant, allowing him entry. The apartment was small, but warm and inviting, filled with the gentle scent of lavender and baby powder. The air hummed with a quiet domesticity that felt both foreign and deeply comforting to him. He approached the bassinet cautiously, his heart pounding in his chest. He gazed at his granddaughter, a tiny human being, a fragile symbol of the family he'd nearly destroyed. A single tear escaped, tracing a path down his weathered cheek. "She's beautiful," he whispered, his voice thick with emotion. Isabella watched him, her expression a complex tapestry of sadness and cautious hope. "Yes," she replied softly. "She is." Silence hung heavy between them, a silent acknowledgement of the chasm that still separated them, but also the fragile bridge they were beginning to build. The unspoken question hung in the air. Could they truly heal? Could he ever earn her forgiveness? The answer, he knew, wouldn't come easily, but the journey had begun. The scent of lavender and baby powder still clung to the air, a comforting aroma that masked the underlying tension. Days bled into weeks, each visit from Julian a tentative step across a chasm of hurt and mistrust. He brought small gifts, a soft, crocheted blanket, a tiny stuffed elephant, offerings meant to ease the distance, not to erase it. He watched Isabella from a respectful distance, never intruding, always attentive. One afternoon, he found her in the park, sunlight dappling through the leaves, illuminating the delicate curve of her cheek as she hummed a lullaby to the baby. He sat on a nearby bench, the crisp autumn air chilling his skin but not his heart. He saw the weariness in her eyes, the the subtle flinch whenever he moved, a ghost of the pain he had inflicted. He longed to speak, to bridge the gap, but the words remained elusive, caught in the thicket of his guilt. Finally, he cleared his throat. She's growing so fast," he said, his voice barely above a whisper, his gaze fixed on the child. Isabella glanced at him, a flicker of something akin to sadness in her eyes. "Yes," she replied softly. "She is." A silence stretched between them, punctuated only by the rustling of leaves and the baby's gurgles. He watched as she carefully adjusted the baby's blanket, her touch gentle, almost reverent. In that moment, he saw a reflection of himself, the protectiveness, the fierce love, a love he had almost destroyed. He longed to reach out, to touch her hand, but hesitated, unsure if he was worthy. The sun dipped below the horizon, painting the sky in hues of orange and purple. A chill wind swept through the park, scattering fallen leaves like whispers. He knew he couldn't stay. He rose to leave, but before he could take a step, Isabella spoke, her voice low but firm. "Thank you," she said, her gaze meeting his. The gratitude was evident, but also a hint of something else, forgiveness, perhaps, or at least the beginning of acceptance. He nodded, the simple gesture laden with unspoken emotions. He turned and walked away, the setting sun casting long shadows behind him. But within his heart, a tiny spark of hope began to glow. The crisp winter air bit at Julian's cheeks as he watched Isabella from across the hospital parking lot. The scent of pine and exhaust fumes mingled, a strangely appropriate backdrop to the turmoil within him. He hadn't seen her since the birth, a hesitant observer from a distance, his guilt a lead weight in his chest. He'd established the foundation, a tangible gesture, but it felt insufficient, a paltry offering for the damage he'd wrought. He saw her then, emerging from the hospital doors, the baby nestled close in a soft, woolly wrap. The sunlight caught the delicate gold in her hair, a reflection of the sun-kissed strands he remembered from his college years, a painful reminder of his past mistakes. Isabella looked fragile. The exhaustion etched on her face was deeper than mere postpartum weariness. It was the residue of months of stress, of battling injustice, of carrying the weight of his cruelty. He started towards her, his footsteps hesitant. The silence stretched between them, thick with unspoken words, charged with the residual electricity of their conflict. He stopped a few feet away, unsure how to approach, his heart hammering against his ribs. "Isabella," he began, his voice raspy from disuse and emotion. The words felt clumsy, inadequate. She looked up, her eyes, once bright and full of life, now held a guarded weariness. There was no anger, no immediate accusation, only a deep, bone-deep exhaustion. "Julian," she replied, her voice barely a whisper, a fragile sound barely audible above the wind's mournful sigh. He reached into his coat pocket, pulling out a small, hand-knitted bunny, its soft fur a stark contrast to the harshness of the setting. For the baby." She looked at the bunny, then at him, her expression unreadable. A silence fell between them, broken only by the distant wail of a siren. The air hung heavy, thick with the unspoken accusations and the fragile hope of a burgeoning reconciliation. He knew a simple gift wouldn't erase the past, but it was a start, a tentative bridge across the chasm of his making. The unspoken question hung between them: could they truly build a future from the wreckage of their past? The wind picked up, swirling fallen leaves around their feet, mirroring the turbulent emotions that swirled within them both. He knew the road to forgiveness was long and arduous, but as he looked into her weary eyes, a flicker of hope, small but persistent, ignited within him. The hospital smelled of antiseptic and something faintly floral, a strange juxtaposition. Sunlight streamed through the tall windows, illuminating dust motes dancing in the air. Isabella, pale but serene, cradled her daughter, a tiny bundle of pink and white. Julian watched from a shadowed corner, his heart a captive bird fluttering against his ribs. The baby's soft sighs were the only sound, a counterpoint to the turmoil raging within him. He'd sent flowers, a ludicrously inadequate gesture. He'd spent sleepless nights replaying his cruelty, the casual dismissal of a pregnant woman, his own flesh and blood. He took a step forward, then hesitated. Isabella's gaze, when she finally lifted it, was not filled with rage, but with a weary sadness that pierced him more deeply than any accusation ever could. There was a fragile beauty in her exhaustion, in the way the sunlight caught the faint shadows under her eyes. "She's beautiful," he finally managed, his voice a rusty hinge. Isabella nodded, a small, almost imperceptible movement. "Her name is Lily." He swallowed, the lump in his throat refusing to budge. "Lily. It suits her." He wanted to touch her, to hold his granddaughter, but the chasm between them felt vast and unbridgeable. The silence hung heavy, thick with unspoken regrets and hesitant hopes. The scent of baby powder and milk mingled with the antiseptic, a strangely comforting aroma that felt both hopeful and burdened. He watched as Isabella gently nuzzled her daughter's cheek, a soft smile touching her lips. The moment felt sacred, a fragile truce in a long-fought war. He didn't know how to bridge the gulf between them, how to ask for forgiveness, how to earn the right to be a part of their lives. Yet, in the quiet intimacy of that shared moment, amidst the muted hum of the hospital, the seed of hope, however tiny, began to take root. The weight on his chest, though still heavy, felt slightly less crushing. He knew the journey ahead would be a long one, but for the first time he saw a glimmer of light at the end of the tunnel. Weeks bled into months. The sterile scent of the hospital faded, replaced by the softer aroma of baby powder and Lily's milky breath. Julian, hesitant at first, began bringing small gifts. A tiny, hand-knitted sweater, a plush lamb, a mobile that tinkled softly above her crib. Isabella accepted them with a quiet grace that both surprised and humbled him. He'd expected anger, rejection, yet she met his tentative gestures with a weariness that spoke volumes of her own healing process. One afternoon, sunlight dappled the living room, illuminating dust motes dancing in the air just as it had in the hospital. Lily gurgled, her tiny hand reaching for a rattle. Isabella, perched on the sofa, smiled, her gaze softening as she watched her daughter. Julian sat across from her, a worn copy of Goodnight Moon in his hands. The silence wasn't tense anymore. It held a fragile peace. She's remarkably like you," Julian finally said, his voice low. He pointed to Lily's tiny fingers, curled around the rattle. "Those fingers. I remember your mother's hands. So delicate." Isabella's eyes welled. "She has your eyes," she whispered, her voice thick with emotion. The same stubborn set to them. A faint smile touched her lips. He cleared his throat. I never meant to hurt you, Isabella. Never." The words felt clumsy, inadequate, but they were genuine. She looked at him, really looked at him, for the first time without the shadow of resentment clouding her eyes. "I know," she said softly, "but knowing and forgiving, those are two different things." The weight of unspoken years hung between them, a heavy silence filled with the rustle of turning pages and Lily's contented babbling. The air, thick with unspoken forgiveness, held the promise of a new beginning. The journey was long, but a small, tentative step had been taken. The scent of lavender and chamomile hung in the air, a calming balm against the chaos that had been their lives. Sunlight streamed through the window, illuminating dust motes dancing in the afternoon light, a silent, serene ballet. Isabella sat cradling Lily, her daughter's soft breaths a gentle rhythm against her chest. The tiny hand, surprisingly strong for one so small, gripped Isabella's finger. Julian stood by the window, the city sprawling beneath him, a miniature world of glittering lights and shadowed streets. He watched Isabella, the curve of her cheek, the way her brow furrowed slightly in concentration as she hummed a lullaby. He felt a familiar ache in his chest, a mixture of guilt and yearning. "She's sleeping soundly," Julian finally said, his voice barely a whisper, afraid to break the fragile peace. Isabella looked up, her eyes, the same shade of hazel as his, held a depth he'd only begun to understand. "Yes," she replied, her voice soft yet firm. "She's a good baby." The silence stretched, comfortable now, not strained. It wasn't the silence of avoidance, but the quiet understanding born from shared experience. The weight of unspoken words hung between them, a heavy cloak that had gradually begun to lighten. He walked closer, his footsteps cautious on the hardwood floor. He saw the subtle tremor in her hand as she adjusted the blanket around Lily. The vulnerability was palpable, a fragile thing he was determined to protect. I've been thinking," he began, his voice hesitant, "about everything." The admission felt monumental, a confession whispered into the quiet intimacy of their shared space. He looked down at his hands, his fingers tracing the lines etched into his palms. They were the hands that had signed contracts worth millions but had failed to cradle his own daughter. Isabella met his gaze, her expression unreadable. The resentment, once a burning fire, had begun to smolder, replaced by an aching weariness. He saw a flicker of something akin to compassion in her eyes, a glimmer of hope in the depths of her hurt. It was a fragile spark, but it was there, and that, he knew, was a beginning. The journey to forgiveness was long, but the first tentative steps had been taken. The path ahead remained uncertain, but filled with the quiet promise of a new dawn. The hospital room smelled faintly of antiseptic and Lily's baby powder. Sunlight, filtered through gauzy curtains, painted stripes across the pristine white sheets. Isabella, pale but resolute, held Lily close, the rhythmic rise and fall of her tiny chest a fragile counterpoint to the storm raging within Isabella's heart. Postpartum depression clung to her like a shadow, whispering doubts and fears. Julian stood in the doorway, hesitant. He'd brought a bouquet of lilies, ironically. He thought of their delicate white petals, a stark contrast to the turmoil within him. He cleared his throat, the sound swallowed by the quiet solemnity of the room. "She's beautiful," he finally managed, his voice rough with emotion. Isabella didn't look up. "She's my daughter." The words were flat, devoid of warmth, a shield against the vulnerability threatening to overwhelm her. He approached slowly, placing the lilies on the bedside table. Their fragrance, sweet and subtle, did little to alleviate the suffocating tension. He wanted to touch her, to offer comfort, but fear held him back. Years of ingrained coldness, of emotional detachment, still held sway. "I know," he said softly, his gaze lingering on Lily's face. I've established the foundation for single mothers." Isabella finally looked at him, her eyes dark and shadowed. "A foundation," she repeated, the words tasting like ash in her mouth. "That doesn't replace what you took from me." The unspoken accusation hung heavy in the air, the lost months of her pregnancy, the stress, the fear, the humiliation. He saw the flicker of pain, the unshed tears, the exhaustion etched deep into her face. His heart ached with a raw guilt he couldn't fully comprehend, a guilt that ran deeper than any financial compensation could ever address. "I know," he whispered again, his voice thick with remorse. "And I know it's not enough, but it's a start, a way to try to make amends." He paused, searching for the right words, words that could bridge the chasm of their fractured past. "I want to be a part of her life, Lily's life, if you'll let me." The silence stretched between them, thick and heavy with the weight of unspoken feelings, with the echoes of a lifetime of regret and the fragile hope for a new beginning. The scent of lilies, a fragile peace offering, hung in the air, a promise, perhaps, of a future yet unwritten. The sound of Lily's gentle breathing filled the silence, a tiny heartbeat in the vastness of their shared sorrow and tentative hope. The sterile scent of the hospital was a stark contrast to the riot of color in Lily's nursery, a tiny haven of pastel pinks and yellows, a world away from the harsh reality of the past few months. Isabella, cradling Lily, felt the familiar pang of postpartum depression, a dull ache that mirrored the exhaustion etched onto her face. Sunlight streamed through the window, illuminating the dust motes dancing in the air, a silent testament to the stillness of the room. Julian stood awkwardly by the door, clutching a small, plush lamb, its innocent face a poignant juxtaposition to the turmoil in his own heart. He hadn't known what to bring. Flowers felt too cliché, too formal. "She's perfect," he finally stammered, his voice hoarse. He watched Isabella, her eyes dark and shadowed, her expression unreadable. The silence stretched, thick and heavy, a suffocating blanket woven from unspoken accusations and tentative hope. The tiny lamb in his hand felt strangely heavy, a physical manifestation of the burden of his past. Isabella finally met his gaze, a flicker of something akin to recognition, maybe even forgiveness, in her eyes. "She needs a grandfather," she whispered, the words barely audible, a fragile bridge across the chasm that separated them. He stepped closer, his heart pounding a frantic rhythm against his ribs. The air crackled with unspoken emotions, a fragile truce between years of animosity and the nascent hope of a future. The plush lamb seemed to soften the harsh lines of his face, easing the years of carefully constructed emotional barriers he had worn as armor. "I know I messed up," he said, his voice cracking, "terribly, but I want to be here, for her, for you. I want to be a part of her life." His gaze fell to Lily's peaceful face, and the stark realization that he'd almost missed out on his daughter. His granddaughter, a monumental loss that made the regret in his heart physical. The lamb seemed to shrink in his hands under the weight of this. The air shifted, the tension subtly easing. The scent of antiseptic and baby powder mingled, creating an odd, strangely comforting aroma. Isabella's lips curved into the faintest of smiles, a tiny crack in the icy fortress she had built around her heart. The journey to healing was long, arduous, filled with obstacles. Yet in the soft glow of the afternoon sun, nestled in the quiet sanctuary of the nursery, a delicate seed of hope was planted. The tiny heartbeat of his granddaughter, a testament to life's resilience, a promise of a future they could build together, resonated in the silence. The hospital room hummed with the low thrum of machinery, a counterpoint to the soft gurgles from Lily's bassinet. Isabella, pale but resolute, gazed at her daughter, a fragile bloom nestled amongst crisp white sheets. Postpartum blues clung to her like a damp shroud, but the tiny hand grasping her finger offered a lifeline. Julian, hesitant, entered, a bouquet of sunflowers, surprisingly cheerful in his hands. He'd chosen them for their vibrant optimism, a stark contrast to the shadows that still haunted him. "She's beautiful," he whispered, his voice rough with disuse and a lifetime of suppressed emotion. He placed the flowers carefully on the bedside table, the scent a fleeting burst of sunshine. Isabella nodded, her gaze unwavering on Lily's peaceful face. The silence stretched, pregnant with unspoken words, years of resentment and hurt hovering between them. The weight of his past actions pressed down on Julian, a crushing burden. He saw the guardedness in her eyes, a wall built brick by brick from his own cruelty. He cleared his throat. I've started a foundation for single mothers to help women like you." The words felt clumsy, inadequate, but they were a start, a tangible expression of his remorse. He watched her face, searching for any sign of softening, any crack in the armor of her pain. A single tear traced a path down Isabella's cheek. It wasn't a tear of anger, but of exhaustion, of the sheer weight of her ordeal. "It's a start," she admitted, her voice barely a breath. The acknowledgement, however small, felt monumental. He reached out a trembling hand, hesitantly touching Lily's tiny fingers. The contact was electric, a jolt of connection that transcended their fractured history. He saw his own features mirrored in his granddaughter's face, a stark reminder of the family he'd almost destroyed. He swallowed, the lump in his throat a testament to the grief and regret that still gnawed at him. The journey to forgiveness was long, arduous, but in this quiet hospital room, under the soft glow of the bedside lamp, a fragile, tentative bridge was being built. The scent of antiseptic and sunflowers mingled in the air, a curious blend of sterile reality and burgeoning hope. The baby's soft breathing filled the silence, a delicate promise of healing and a new beginning. Julian's empire, once a cold, glass and steel monument to his ambition, was undergoing a metamorphosis. The sterile, impersonal offices were being redesigned, incorporating natural light and softer, warmer colors. Gone were the stark, minimalist desks. In their place sat collaborative workspaces, buzzing with a newfound energy. The air, once thick with the unspoken pressure of performance, now hummed with a gentler rhythm of teamwork and mutual respect. He'd instituted mandatory parental leave, significantly increased minimum wage, and established an employee assistance program, tangible manifestations of his remorse. The change wasn't just cosmetic. It seeped into the very fabric of the company, reflecting the profound shift in his own values. He even instituted a mentorship program for young, aspiring entrepreneurs from disadvantaged backgrounds, a direct response to his own privileged upbringing and the blind spots it had created. The transformation was gradual, painstaking, a daily struggle against ingrained habits and deeply rooted insecurities, but undeniably real. The weight of his past actions still pressed down on him, but now it was tempered by the quiet satisfaction of making amends. The scent of freshly brewed coffee, a far cry from the expensive espresso he once consumed, now filled his office each morning, a subtle reminder of his altered priorities. He spent his lunch breaks at the company cafeteria, engaging in genuine conversations with his employees, something unimaginable in the past. The courtroom was silent, save for the rhythmic tick-tock of the grandfather clock in the corner. The air hung heavy with unspoken tension, thick with the scent of old wood and anticipation. Isabella, her hand resting gently on her swollen belly, met Julian's gaze. His eyes, usually steely and cold, were now filled with a raw, unfamiliar vulnerability. He saw the exhaustion etched on her face, the worry lines around her eyes, the faint tremor in her hand. It hit him with the force of a physical blow. He had inflicted this. I never meant to hurt you, Isabella," he whispered, his voice barely audible above the clock's ticking. The words felt inadequate, clumsy, a pathetic attempt to mend a gaping wound. Isabella's gaze was unwavering. "Your actions spoke louder than your words, father." The word father hung in the air, strange and heavy with a lifetime of unspoken history. A single tear traced a path down her cheek, catching the light like a tiny, glittering jewel. The judge cleared his throat, the sound sharp and jarring in the sudden silence. He looked from Julian to Isabella, his expression unreadable. The weight of their shared history pressed down on the room, palpable and suffocating. Julian felt a wave of nausea, the familiar tightness in his chest returning. He had created this pain, this chasm between them. The finality of this realization crashed over him. Outside the courtroom, the spring air felt surprisingly cold against Isabella's skin. Sarah, her lawyer, squeezed her hand. "He's broken, Isabella. He really is." The words held a quiet satisfaction, but also a sense of weary understanding. The victory felt hollow. Isabella nodded, a faint smile playing on her lips. "He's finally seeing it?" she murmured, the weight of years lifting from her shoulders. The journey had been arduous, filled with pain and anger, but the seed of forgiveness had begun to take root. The path to healing was long, but she was finally ready to walk it. The sun peeked through the clouds, casting a warm ray of light onto her face, a promise of a brighter tomorrow. A new beginning. Julian's empire, once a symbol of cold, hard ambition, was subtly shifting. The mahogany of his office, once comforting, now felt oppressive. He stared out at the city sprawling beneath him, a cityscape that mirrored the fractured landscape of his own soul. The crisp air from the open window carried the distant sounds of a city awakening, a stark contrast to the turmoil within him. He'd implemented new employee policies, fairer wages, better benefits, and policies born not from a sudden burst of philanthropy, but from the searing shame of his past actions. This wasn't charity. It was penance. He picked up a framed photograph, Isabella, radiant, cradling her baby daughter. The child's tiny hand clutched Isabella's finger, a miniature replica of Julian's own. The sight choked him. He'd almost lost them both. A wave of regret washed over him, a bitter tide eroding the foundations of his carefully constructed life. His phone buzzed. It was Isabella. He hesitated, his thumb hovering over the answer button. The simple act felt monumental. He swallowed, took a deep breath, and answered. Julian. Her voice, soft and hesitant, reached him across the miles. He felt a familiar knot tightening in his chest. Isabella, he replied, his voice rough. He could hear the faint sounds of a baby cooing in the background. A tiny, hopeful melody. The Foundation's first grant is going to a women's shelter, she said, her voice a gentle tremor. It's remarkable, Julian. A fragile silence hung between them, filled only with the hum of the city and the unspoken words that still lingered between them. The silence wasn't awkward. It was pregnant with the weight of shared history, of healing, of a future painstakingly built from the ruins of the past. It was a silence that spoke volumes about the progress they'd made, a fragile peace built on the ashes of his cruelty. The scent of freshly brewed coffee, sharp and invigorating, filled Julian's redesigned office. Gone were the cold, steel accents. In their place were warm woods and natural light. The transformation mirrored the one occurring within him. He reviewed the quarterly reports, the numbers a stark contrast to the emotional turmoil he still navigated. He wasn't just looking at profits. He was analyzing the well-being of his employees. His phone buzzed again. A text from Isabella. Mia's first steps. Video to follow. A smile, genuine and unguarded, spread across his face. He'd seen the videos before, and yet, each one brought a fresh surge of joy, a testament to the preciousness of his newfound family. Later that afternoon, Isabella arrived at his office. Mia nestled securely in a carrier. The baby gurgled, her tiny fingers reaching out to grasp Julian's. He felt a surge of protectiveness, a deep well of love he'd never known he could possess. She's getting so big, Julian murmured, his voice thick with emotion. Isabella smiled, a hesitant yet genuine expression. Yes, she's amazing. She hesitated, then added, Thank you for everything. For what, exactly? Julian asked, his eyes searching hers. For trying, she replied softly. For actually trying to be a father. He leaned closer, his heart pounding. The weight of his past actions, the years of cruelty and self-absorption, still pressed upon him. But he held her gaze, meeting her vulnerability with his own. I'll never stop trying, he promised, his voice barely above a whisper. The scent of baby powder and Isabella's delicate perfume filled the air, a comforting blend of forgiveness and hope. The city outside hummed with activity, but in that quiet office, surrounded by the sounds of Mia's soft cooing, a fragile peace had been achieved. It was a peace hard-earned, built on the ruins of his past, a peace that whispered of new beginnings. The courtroom hummed with a low thrum of anticipation. The air, thick with tension, carried the scent of old wood and nervous sweat. Isabella sat, her hand resting gently on her swollen belly, her gaze unwavering as Julian watched from the defendant's table. He'd expected anger, bitterness, but her expression was something else entirely. A quiet strength, a weary acceptance. It unnerved him. Sarah, her lawyer, concluded her closing argument, her voice ringing with righteous indignation. The judge, a woman with kind eyes and a stern demeanor, leaned forward, her attention riveted on Isabella. The final verdict arrived, a hushed silence falling over the room. Guilty of wrongful termination, discrimination, and emotional distress. The monetary compensation was significant, enough to secure Isabella and Mia's future. But the true victory lay in the public acknowledgement of Julian's actions, the shattering of his carefully constructed image. Outside the courthouse, the sun beat down on the pavement. The relief was palpable, yet tinged with a residue of sadness. Isabella hugged Sarah, tears silently tracing paths down her cheeks. She wasn't celebrating a triumph. She was acknowledging a painful chapter's end. Then, she saw him, standing across the street, a solitary figure amidst the bustling crowd. Julian. He looked thinner, his usual arrogance replaced by a vulnerability that tugged at her heart. He hadn't approached her. He merely watched, his face etched with a mix of regret and apprehension. A flicker of something akin to hope kindled within her. This wasn't the end. This was, perhaps, the beginning of something different, something healing. The path ahead remained uncertain, littered with challenges. But for the first time since the dismissal, Isabella felt a fragile sense of peace settle over her. The weight of the past, though heavy, no longer felt crushing. A new dawn was breaking, however faintly. The sterile scent of antiseptic hung heavy in the air as Isabella cradled her daughter, Mia. Sunlight streamed through the hospital window, painting dust motes dancing in the golden light. Julian stood awkwardly by the door, his expensive suit a jarring contrast to the worn floral wallpaper. He hadn't known what to expect, but the sight of Isabella, her face etched with exhaustion yet radiating a soft, motherly glow, stole his breath. Mia, tiny and perfect, slept soundly in her mother's arms. "She's beautiful," he whispered, his voice raspy with disuse. Isabella looked up, her eyes, usually sparkling with life, now shadowed with a lingering sadness. "Yes," she agreed, her voice low. "She is." The silence stretched, thick and uncomfortable, filled only with the soft rhythm of Mia's breathing. He shifted, unsure of how to proceed. I wanted to apologize again," he began, his words clumsy and inadequate. "For everything." Isabella didn't meet his gaze. "The apology is appreciated," she said quietly, her fingers tracing Mia's tiny hand. "But it doesn't erase what happened." He nodded, understanding the depth of her words. He knew the monetary compensation, the public apology, the changes he'd made to his company were just superficial gestures. True forgiveness wouldn't come easily, if at all. He watched her, seeing the weariness in her posture, the quiet strength in her grip on Mia. He wanted to reach out, to touch her hand, but he hesitated, fearing rejection. The weight of his past actions pressed down on him, a heavy cloak he couldn't quite shed. The faint scent of baby powder and antiseptic mingled with the lingering scent of his own regret. He knew the road ahead would be long, but for the first time in a long time he felt a flicker of hope. A genuine hope, not fueled by ambition or self-preservation, but by the fragile, precious life sleeping in his daughter's arms. His granddaughter, his family. The courtroom was hushed, the air thick with unspoken tension. The judge's gavel, a symbol of finality, lay silent on the polished wood. Isabella sat, holding Mia close, the baby's soft weight a comforting anchor against the storm. The scent of baby powder mingled with the lingering scent of the courtroom's sterile cleanliness. Julian watched, his eyes fixed on his daughter, a mixture of guilt and dawning understanding etched on his face. He saw the subtle tremor in her hand as she clutched Mia. He saw the weariness etched into her lines, the quiet strength that had carried her through this ordeal. He had thought money could fix things. He now saw its inadequacy against the profound hurt he had inflicted. Sarah, her lawyer, offered a small, encouraging smile. It was a silent acknowledgement of the battle won, a recognition of Isabella's courage. The settlement reached was substantial, a testament to the strength of their case and Julian's desperation to make amends. But more important than the money was the acknowledgement, the public admission of his wrongdoing, the acceptance of his daughter. "The court finds in favor of the plaintiff." The judge's voice, amplified by the microphone, resonated through the room. The words hung in the air, a fragile bridge between past and future. The judgment wasn't just a legal victory, it was a symbolic release. Outside the courthouse, sunlight warmed Isabella's face. Mia gurgled contentedly. Julian hesitated, then approached slowly. He didn't reach out, knowing the touch was still fragile, tentative. "Isabella," he began, his voice low. He searched for the right words, words that could encompass the vastness of his regret, the depth of his remorse, words that could begin to heal the chasm he had created. He found only a simple, heartfelt plea. "Thank you." The simple word, burdened with the weight of his past actions, hung in the air between them. It was a start, a hopeful beginning to a long journey. The bustling city faded as Isabella and Julian stepped into the quiet sanctuary of her apartment. Mia, nestled in her car seat, gurgled softly, oblivious to the unspoken tension hanging heavy in the air. The scent of lavender from Isabella's diffuser mingled with the faint aroma of baby powder and the lingering trace of coffee. Sunlight streamed through the window, illuminating dust motes dancing in the golden beams. I wanted to talk about the custody arrangements. Julian began, his voice a low rumble, hesitant and unsure. He avoided her eyes, his gaze fixed on Mia's tiny, grasping hand. The weight of his past actions pressed down on him, a suffocating blanket of guilt. Isabella met his gaze, her expression a carefully constructed mask of composure. The years of hurt, the betrayal, still simmered beneath the surface. Yet, there was a flicker of something else, a tentative hope, a fragile yearning for the father she had never known. "I've already spoken to my lawyer," she said, her voice calm but firm. "Joint custody, 50-50. But there are conditions." Julian's heart pounded against his ribs. Conditions. He braced himself for the worst. "Mia needs stability," Isabella continued, her gaze unwavering. This won't be easy. But for her sake, we need to find a way to work together. Respect boundaries. No more outbursts, no more attempts to control the situation." She paused, taking a deep breath. "I need you to be present, Julian. Truly present. Not just financially, but emotionally." The silence stretched, thick and heavy. Julian felt the sting of tears pricking his eyes, years of suppressed emotion threatening to overwhelm him. He nodded slowly, his throat tight with unshed tears. "I understand. I will do everything I can to be the father she deserves." He looked at Mia, his daughter's daughter, a tiny bridge spanning the chasm of his past mistakes. He swallowed hard, feeling the weight of a life unlived, a family almost lost, pressing down on his shoulders. The simple words, though sincere, held a profound weight, a promise hanging heavy in the hushed apartment. The future remained uncertain, but for the first time in a long time, Julian felt a glimmer of hope, a faint but persistent light breaking through the darkness. The courtroom air hung thick with the scent of old wood and anticipation. The judge, a woman with eyes that had seen too much, leaned forward. The verdict was imminent. Julian watched Isabella, her face pale but resolute, a stark contrast to the meticulously tailored suit he wore. He'd spent weeks agonizing over this moment, the culmination of a year of legal battles, public shaming, and soul-searching. He'd lost so much, yet the emptiness gnawed at him less than the fear of losing her completely. Isabella's lawyer, Sarah, rose. "Your Honor," she began, her voice clear and strong. "The DNA evidence is irrefutable. The plaintiff's suffering, both physical and emotional, is undeniable. We are not seeking to destroy Mr. Thorne, but to establish accountability and ensure the well-being of his grandchild." Julian felt a tremor run through him. Sarah's words weren't about vengeance. They spoke of healing. He'd been so consumed by his own self-preservation, he hadn't seen the possibility of restorative justice. The judge's gavel fell, a sharp crack breaking the silence. "The court finds in favor of the plaintiff. Mr. Thorne is ordered to pay financial compensation and contribute to the child's welfare. Furthermore, he is mandated to attend supervised family therapy sessions." The weight of the gavel echoed the weight in Julian's chest. It wasn't just a legal decision. It was a life sentence to confront his past. He looked at Isabella, a lifetime of unspoken words and missed opportunities swirling between them. He saw not just anger, but a quiet, weary acceptance. A small, almost imperceptible nod passed between them, a silent acknowledgement of a shared future, however uncertain. He saw the beginning of a path, not to undo the past, but to build a new, fragile bridge across the chasm of his mistakes. The courtroom dissolved into a blur of movement as the judge adjourned, leaving Julian and Isabella to face the echoes of the past and the whispers of a future they would build together. The legal battle concluded, leaving a residue of silence heavier than the judge's gavel. The crisp air of the autumn afternoon felt strangely muted, the vibrant fall colors outside the courthouse window blurring into an indistinct wash. Inside, Isabella sat, her hand resting on her swollen belly, a fragile smile playing on her lips. The victory felt hollow, the legal win a poor substitute for the years stolen, the pain inflicted. Julian watched her, the tailored suit suddenly feeling like a suffocating cage. He approached slowly, the polished floor echoing each hesitant step. He stopped before her, the weight of his actions settling heavily between them. "Isabella?" he began, his voice a low rumble, the years of practiced self-assuredness dissolving into a tremor. I need to apologize." Isabella met his gaze, her eyes reflecting not just anger, but a deep-seated weariness. "Apology isn't enough, Julian," she said, her voice soft yet firm. "Actions speak louder than words. What you're going to do from now on matters more than what you say now." The scent of her lavender perfume, faint yet persistent, reminded him of a gentler time, a time he'd erased with his own callous ambition. The sunlight filtering through the courthouse windows cast long shadows across the floor, highlighting the chasm between them, a gulf carved by years of indifference and hurtful actions. He saw the scars on her heart, mirrored in the lines etched around her eyes, the delicate paleness of her skin, a testament to the toll his cruelty had taken. He knew that true forgiveness wouldn't come easily, if at all, but he also knew that he had to try. He had to build that fragile bridge, brick by painful brick. This was just the beginning of a long, arduous journey towards redemption, and he was prepared to start walking. The courtroom buzzed with hushed whispers as the judge read the final ruling. A settlement was reached, a sum far exceeding any initial expectation, but the money felt insignificant against the backdrop of the emotional wreckage. The crisp scent of lemon polish from the judge's mahogany desk seemed to mock the lingering bitterness. Outside, the late afternoon sun cast long shadows, stretching across the courthouse steps. Isabella, her hand protectively cradling her swollen belly, felt the weight of the past pressing down, a physical burden almost as heavy as the child she carried. Julian watched her, a flicker of something akin to shame in his eyes, the tailored suit feeling less a shield and more a prison. He walked toward her, the cobblestones cold beneath his shoes, the sound swallowed by the city's muted roar. The air hummed with unspoken words, with regret and the tentative hope of a future he'd nearly destroyed. "Isabella," he began, his voice raw, devoid of the usual arrogance. He paused, the words catching in his throat. He'd rehearsed apologies countless times, each one falling flat against the stark reality of his actions. Isabella met his gaze, her eyes mirroring a storm of emotions: anger, hurt, a weariness that etched lines around her eyes, making them look older, wearier than her years. "The money," she began, her voice quiet, controlled, "doesn't change what you did. It doesn't erase the pain." A single tear traced a path down her cheek, lost in the autumn wind. He nodded, understanding dawning on his face. He'd expected anger, vitriol, even hatred, but this quiet acceptance, this devastating weariness, was far more crushing. "I know," he whispered, his voice choked with emotion, "and I don't expect forgiveness. Not yet, but I promise to earn it, every single day." He looked down at her stomach, a wave of complex emotions washing over him. A future he'd almost erased, a grandchild he'd almost never known. He reached out, his hand hesitant, hovering above hers. She didn't flinch. She didn't pull away. The silence stretched between them, thick with unspoken words, promises hanging in the air like the scent of autumn leaves. The setting sun painted the sky in hues of orange and purple, a vibrant contrast to the somber scene unfolding beneath it. It was a fragile beginning, a tentative step towards a bridge built on regret, on the arduous path to redemption. The future remained uncertain, but for the first time, a faint glimmer of hope pierced the darkness. The weight of the past still pressed down, but it was not insurmountable. It was a beginning, The courtroom felt colder than the November air outside. The scent of old wood and stale coffee hung heavy, a bitter counterpoint to the judge's surprisingly gentle pronouncements. The settlement, a staggering sum, was finalized. The legal battle, a brutal war fought on the battleground of Julian's arrogance and Isabella's quiet resilience, was over. Yet, a profound silence settled, heavier than the weight of the legal documents. Isabella stood, her hand instinctively going to her abdomen, the slight curve a poignant reminder of the child she carried. A child conceived amidst the wreckage of Julian's cruelty. The courtroom, once a place of sharp accusations and bitter recriminations, now felt like a mausoleum, reflecting the emotional toll exacted on both parties. Julian watched her, his meticulously tailored suit suddenly feeling like a suffocating cage. The arrogance that had been his shield for so long crumbled, replaced by a raw, vulnerable emotion he had long suppressed: regret. He cleared his throat, the sound thin and reedy. "Isabella," he began, his voice a tremor in the echoing silence. "I." Isabella's gaze was unwavering, her eyes reflecting a storm of emotions, a poignant mix of hurt, weary acceptance, and a flicker of something else, a fragile spark of hope. "The money," she said, her voice soft but firm, "doesn't erase what happened." A single tear escaped, tracing a glistening path down her cheek, a silent testament to the depth of her pain. Julian nodded, understanding dawning in his eyes, a painful recognition of the chasm between the superficiality of his past actions and the depth of the emotional wound he had inflicted. He walked towards her, his movements hesitant, his usually confident stride now burdened by the weight of his past. He reached for her hand, his touch tentative, unsure. She didn't pull away. Their hands met, a silent acknowledgement of the arduous path ahead, a fragile bridge built upon regret and the tentative hope of a future born from the ashes of a shattered past. The unspoken words hung heavy in the air, a promise, a plea, a tentative beginning. Outside, the city's sounds pulsed, a muted symphony contrasting with the intensity of the moment, a silent testament to the complex dance between justice and forgiveness. The crisp autumn air bit at their cheeks as they walked, the silence between them a stark contrast to the cacophony of the city. Julian, his tailored suit feeling strangely constricting, watched Isabella's slight frame. The late afternoon sun cast long shadows, highlighting the delicate curve of her belly. He swallowed, the lump in his throat a physical manifestation of his guilt. "The baby, she's due soon," he said finally, his voice rough with unspoken apologies. Isabella nodded, her gaze fixed on the swirling leaves beneath their feet. The unspoken words hung between them, heavier than the falling leaves. "Yes," she replied, her voice barely a whisper, yet carrying the weight of a lifetime of unspoken hurts. They reached a small park. The rusty swing set a poignant symbol of lost childhoods. A child's laughter echoed from a nearby playground, a stark reminder of the family Julian had so carelessly thrown away. He watched a young father gently push his daughter on a swing, his heart aching with a longing he hadn't known existed. I want to be a part of her life," he said, the words stumbling over each other. "I know I don't deserve it, but..." Isabella turned, her eyes, though still tinged with sadness, held a flicker of something else, a hesitant hope. The wind whipped a stray strand of hair across her face. She tucked it behind her ear, the simple gesture a quiet act of self-possession. "It's not about deserving," she said softly. "It's about trying, about showing her what a grandfather can be." The words hung in the air, a fragile bridge built across the chasm of his past mistakes. He saw the unspoken question in her eyes. Could he truly change? The setting sun painted the sky in hues of orange and purple, a silent promise of a new dawn. Julian looked at Isabella, at the woman he had wronged, the daughter he had denied, and for the first time, he saw the possibility of redemption, not just for himself, but for them all. The path ahead was long, fraught with challenges, but the first step, this tentative walk in the park, felt like a victory, a new beginning, The courtroom buzzed with hushed whispers as the judge read the final ruling. A small, almost imperceptible smile played on Isabella's lips. It wasn't the victory she'd initially craved, but a compromise born of weary acceptance. Julian received a hefty fine, a public apology demanded, and a mandated contribution to a charity supporting single mothers. The legal battle, a brutal war fought in the cold, sterile halls of justice, was finally over. Outside, the crisp winter air nipped at Julian's cheeks. He watched Isabella climb into a waiting car, her silhouette framed against the stark gray sky. The sight of her, small and fragile yet radiating an inner strength that had surprised even him, stirred a deep ache within him. He'd lost his arrogance, replaced by a quiet humility born of harsh lessons learned. That evening, he found himself at Isabella's small apartment building, a bouquet of lilies clutched in his hand. He hadn't expected to be received. A nervous tremor ran through him as he knocked. He'd lost so much, but the thought of never truly knowing his daughter and granddaughter was a loss far greater than any financial setback. The door creaked open, revealing Isabella, her eyes red-rimmed, but her face calm. "Come in," she said quietly, her voice tinged with a weariness that mirrored his own. The apartment was small, sparsely furnished, but filled with a warm, comforting light. The scent of chamomile tea hung in the air, a gentle counterpoint to the bitter chill outside. I wanted to apologize again," Julian began, his voice hesitant. "For everything, truly." He offered her the lilies. She took them, a small, almost imperceptible smile touching her lips. "It's a start," she said softly, her gaze fixed on the flowers. "But the road ahead is long." She gestured to the baby's bassinet in the corner. A tiny, sleeping figure nestled within. The child, his granddaughter, was the silent witness to their reconciliation, a fragile thread binding the shattered pieces of their family. The weight of his past actions settled upon Julian. He wouldn't erase the hurt, but he would try, tirelessly, to build a future worthy of their forgiveness. He had begun to change, but the journey was far from over. The lilies, a fragile symbol of a new beginning, seemed to hold the promise of something beautiful amidst the scars of the past. He knew the path would be long and arduous, yet he was finally willing to walk it. The courtroom's sterile scent of antiseptic and old wood lingered on Julian's clothes long after he left. He stared at his reflection, a gaunt, older man haunted by the weight of his actions. The settlement, though substantial, felt insignificant compared to the chasm he'd created. He hailed a cab, the city lights blurring into a kaleidoscope of guilt. Reaching Isabella's apartment, the faint scent of lavender and baby powder eased the tightness in his chest. He knocked, his hand trembling. The door opened slowly, revealing Isabella, her eyes shadowed but her expression surprisingly peaceful. The baby's soft coos emanated from within. "Come in," she said, her voice husky. The apartment, small but tidy, felt different now, softer. A framed ultrasound picture sat on the mantelpiece. Julian stepped inside. The lilies he carried a clumsy offering. I wanted to see her," he stammered, his gaze drawn to the bassinet where a tiny hand reached out. Isabella nodded, a flicker of something akin to forgiveness in her eyes. "She's asleep," she whispered, her voice barely above a breath. "But you can look." He approached cautiously, his heart pounding a rhythm against his ribs. The sight of his granddaughter, a miniature version of himself with Isabella's gentle eyes, was overwhelming. A tear traced a path down his cheek, unnoticed. Silence hung between them, thick with unspoken emotions. The ticking of a clock, the distant city hum, became deafening. "I know an apology isn't enough," Julian finally said, his voice raw with emotion. "But I'll dedicate my life to making amends, to being the grandfather she deserves." Isabella's gaze softened. "It's a start," she said, her voice still tinged with weariness, but laced with a fragile hope. "We need to work on this together. For her." She touched the baby's hand, a small smile playing on her lips. The lilies, vibrant against the soft backdrop of the apartment, seemed to echo that fragile hope. The road ahead would be long, arduous, and filled with challenges. But for the first time, Julian felt a glimmer of peace. He wasn't just a billionaire anymore, he was a father, a grandfather. And the journey to becoming worthy of that title had just begun. Sunlight streamed through the expansive windows of Julian's redesigned office, a stark contrast to the cold, minimalist space of before. He sat at his desk, the mahogany gleaming, a stark contrast to the worn, leather-bound book in his hands, a children's story, a gift from Isabella. He traced the illustration of a smiling bunny with a calloused finger. The phone rang, jarring him from his reverie. It was Sarah, his lawyer. "The case is officially closed," she said, her voice a calm counterpoint to the storm brewing inside him. "The settlement funds are being used to establish the Isabella Thorne Foundation." He felt a quiet satisfaction, but it was overshadowed by a deeper longing. Later, at Isabella's apartment, the aroma of baking bread filled the air. His granddaughter, Lily, gurgled happily in her bouncy chair. Isabella, radiant, offered him a warm mug of tea. "She's learning to say Papa," she said, a soft smile playing on her lips. Julian's throat tightened. "Papa?" he repeated, the word tasting strange and wonderful on his tongue. Lily's tiny hand reached out, grasping his finger. He felt a rush of overwhelming love, a wave of pure, unadulterated joy. The warmth of the tea, the scent of bread, the feel of Lily's tiny hand. These simple things held more meaning than all his wealth ever could. He looked at Isabella, her eyes shining with a newfound light. The path to forgiveness had been long and arduous, but they were finally walking it together, hand in hand, towards a future filled with the promise of a family, finally whole.